Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. Explaining every Fallout mutant, Fallout lore. Section 1. Intro. Welcome, fellow wanderer of the broken world, to a long and quiet reckoning with what the wasteland made when it was left alone long enough to make something. Tonight we trace the full and unhurried truth of mutation, not as spectacle, not as the inventory of horrors that a person might catalogue in daylight with a weapon in hand, but as the deeper story of what happens to life when the forces acting upon it are so vast and so comprehensive that life itself has no choice but to become something it was never designed to be. We will move through the creatures and the transformed beings of every region that the Great War touched, from the radroaches in the basements of collapsed cities to the beings who were once people and remain people in every sense that matters, carrying their memories through bodies that the world remade without asking their permission. So settle in. Let your breathing slow and your body find the stillness that the wasteland rarely permits. There is no urgency here, no threat in the dark beyond the door, no Geiger counter clicking at the edge of your awareness. Simply let the story of what the broken world produced move through you the way wind moves through the ruins of a city that no longer needs to be in a hurry about anything. Close your eyes when you are ready, and let us begin. The first thing to understand, before any creature is named or described, is that the wasteland's mutants are not mistakes. They are not failed versions of what came before, warped and pitiable remnants of a biological order that the bombs disrupted. They are successful versions of something new organisms that found within the conditions of the post-war world exactly the pressure that natural selection requires to do its work, and that responded to that pressure with the same fundamental insistence that life has always brought to the problem of continuing. The Deathclaw is not a broken Jackson's chameleon. The ghoul who remembers the pre-war world and walks through its ruins with 2 centuries of memory intact is not a failed human being. The rad scorpion is not a scorpion that went wrong. They are what the world made when the world changed, and they are, in most cases, precisely what a changed world required. Whether that truth is comforting or disturbing depends entirely on where you are standing when you consider it, and what is standing between you and the nearest example. But the truth itself is not in question. The wasteland endures because what lives in it has learned to endure with it, and the learning took the full biological creativity of 2 centuries of uninterrupted transformation to produce. Tonight we attend to that transformation with the patience and the care that it deserves. Section 2. The biology of a broken world. Radiation, FEV, and the mechanics of mutation. To understand the wasteland's creatures, not merely to identify them and assess their threat, but to genuinely understand what they are and how they came to be, it is necessary first to understand the 2 great engines that produced them. Because nearly every organism in the post-war world that differs substantially from its pre-war ancestor owes that difference to one of 2 mechanisms, and in some cases, to both operating simultaneously. These mechanisms are not mysterious in the sense of being beyond comprehension. They are the applications of forces that existed in the world before the bombs fell, accelerated to a degree and applied at a scale that the world before the bombs had never witnessed. The first is radiation. The second is a biological agent that the pre-war world created deliberately and that the post-war world inherited without the institutions that might have managed it responsibly. Understanding these 2 forces does not reduce the strangeness of what they produced, but it makes that strangeness legible. It gives the wanderer moving through the wasteland a framework for comprehending why the world looks the way it looks, and why the things that move through it are what they are. Radiation in the quantities that the Great War deposited across the North American continent, is fundamentally a mutagen, a force that damages the molecular structures through which living organisms encode and transmit their biological information. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, this property of radiation was expressed overwhelmingly as death. The ionizing particles that saturated the soil and the water and the air interacted with the cellular machinery of every living thing they encountered, breaking the chemical bonds that held DNA together, disrupting the repair mechanisms that cells use to address routine molecular damage, overwhelming the biological systems that had evolved over hundreds of millions of years to maintain the integrity of genetic information across generations. Most organisms that received significant radiation exposure in the first weeks and months after the Great War simply died their cells, unable to sustain the damage being done to them, their organ systems failing in the sequence that acute radiation syndrome follows, regardless of the species experiencing it. This was the immediate biological reality of the post-war world, and it was comprehensive. But radiation does not act only as a destroyer. Over longer timescales, and at the lower doses that characterize chronic rather than acute exposure, the doses that the contaminated landscape has delivered to every organism living within it across 2 centuries of continuous environmental radiation, it acts as an accelerant. It introduces mutations into the genetic material of living organisms at rates that far exceed the natural background mutation rate that drives ordinary evolutionary change. And in doing so, it subjects populations to a pressure of selection so intense and so sustained that organisms, which in a stable environment might have required millions of years to develop new biological characteristics and develop them, instead, across decades, the wasteland compresses geological time. It takes the patient, incremental work of evolution and forces it into the span of a human lifetime. And the organisms that survive this forcing process are not the organisms that entered it. They are something shaped by the specific demands of a specific landscape, harder, more resistant to the contamination that shaped them, possessed of biological capabilities their ancestors never required, because the world their ancestors inhabited never demanded them. This is not uniformly or reliably beneficial in any conventional sense. The mutations that radiation accelerates are not directed toward any purpose. They do not build toward a plan. They simply occur, and those that happen to suit their organism to the conditions in which it lives persist, and those that do not, do not. The resulting ecology is coherent, not because anyone designed it, but because the pressure that produced it was consistent, the same contamination, the same irradiated water and irradiated soil and irradiated air, applying the same relentless selection across every species simultaneously for long enough that the results could compound. What the wasteland's ecology represents, 2 centuries after the bombs, is the outcome of this process operating without interference across every level of biological organization, from the bacterial upward. It is not beautiful in the way that the pre-war world's managed landscapes were beautiful. It is beautiful in the way that something functional and self-sustaining on its own terms is always beautiful, coherent, organized, capable of continuing without the assistance of the civilization that inadvertently initiated it. The second engine of transformation is the forced evolutionary virus, and unlike radiation, it was not an accident. It was a creation, a deliberate product of the pre-war scientific and military-industrial complex, developed at the West Tech Research Facility in California under the institutional designation Project Safe House. Its original purpose was benign in the framework of its time, which is to say that it was intended to serve a military function that the people who commissioned it believed was necessary. The concept was a pan-immunity virion, a biological agent that could be administered to soldiers and that would rewrite their immune systems comprehensively enough to protect them against the full range of biological, chemical weapons that an adversary might deploy on a nuclear battlefield. The researchers who developed it understood that they were working with something of extraordinary capability, a virus capable of intervening in the genetic code of a living organism, not merely at the surface level of immune function, but at the fundamental level of cellular biology itself. They proceeded anyway, because the institutions they worked within had concluded that the potential military advantage justified the research. The forced evolutionary virus works by doing precisely what its name describes. It infects a host organism and rewrites the host's genetic material at the cellular level, restructuring biological systems according to the parameters built into its own code. In the experimental stages, Westtech's researchers tested it on insects and plant life, observing the transformations it produced and adjusting the viral parameters in response. The organisms they created in those early tests were disturbing enough that the project attracted the attention of the United States military at the highest levels, which was exactly what the researchers at Westtech had been hoping would happen. Military interest meant military funding, and military funding meant that the project could pursue its most ambitious directions without the resource constraints that had previously limited it. The project was transferred to the Mariposa military base in California, where a second research facility had been constructed specifically to house the more sensitive phases of the work, the phases that involved human subjects, which the researchers understood could not be conducted in a civilian setting without generating the kind of public attention that would complicate the institutional relationships that made the project possible. The human experiments conducted at Mariposa were not undertaken with the consent of those subjected to them. The subjects were prisoners, transported to the facility and exposed to the forced evolutionary virus under conditions that the researchers' own documentation described with the bureaucratic detachment of people who had long since ceased to experience the gap between their professional language and the reality it described. The results were, by the research program's own metrics, transformative. The virus restructured the human body at a fundamental level, producing changes in physical size, strength, and biological resilience that exceeded anything the program's initial projections had anticipated. They also produced changes in cognitive function that the program had not anticipated and that its designers had not specified, reductions in higher-order thinking, emotional range, and the social and psychological complexity that characterized human cognition, replaced in varying degrees by something more direct, more reactive, and less legible in the framework of human personality. When the bombs fell on October 23rd, the Mariposa vats were left running. The staff who evacuated or died in the immediate aftermath of the strikes left behind a facility in which the forced evolutionary virus continued to develop in its tank environment. Exposed to the radiation that the bombing had introduced into the surrounding soil and water, the virus adapted. It incorporated elements of the environmental radiation into its own biological structure and emerged from the 2-century period of unattended development as something that shared its origins with the Westtech research product, but that was no longer quite the same organism. The Mariposa strain of FEV, which would go on to produce the super mutants of California and which the master would use as the instrument of his attempt to accelerate human evolution by force, was a post-war creation as much as a pre-war one, a biological legacy that the bombs had shaped as thoroughly as they had shaped everything else. The interaction between radiation and FEV is not always straightforward, and the complexity of this interaction is part of what makes the wastelands biology so varied in its expressions. An organism that has been extensively pre-irradiated before exposure to the forced evolutionary virus responds differently from one that enters the exposure without prior radiation damage. The distinction matters because in many regions of the post-war world, the humans who were exposed to FEV, whether voluntarily, as in the vaults that used it experimentally, or involuntarily, as in the master's operations, had been living for years or decades in environments that had already modified their biology through chronic radiation exposure. The outcomes of FEV transformation in pre-irradiated subjects tend toward greater physical transformation and more severe cognitive reduction than in subjects with lower prior exposure. This distinction, which the researchers at Mariposa had identified in their pre-war work, and which the Masters scientists documented in the post-war period, has enormous consequences for the character of the different super-mutant populations that would establish themselves across the regions of the wasteland. It also illuminates why the same virus, applied to human beings in different geographic and biological conditions, could produce results that appeared so different from one another as to seem unrelated. What the forced evolutionary virus and radiation share, beyond their biological mechanisms, is a certain indifference to the outcomes they produce. Neither force has a preference. Neither is working toward a goal. Radiation disrupts and accelerates because those are its physical properties, not because it intends anything by them. The forced evolutionary virus restructures its host because that is the function it was designed to perform, and it continues performing that function across 2 centuries of post-war existence with a consistency that no human institution in the wasteland has managed to match. The creatures that these 2 forces produced were not willed into existence by any intelligence with a stake in their creation. They exist because the conditions that produced them existed, and they continue to exist because those conditions continue. The wasteland that the Wanderer moves through is not a world that someone made. It is a world that made itself from the materials that the Great War left behind, according to the logic of biology operating under extraordinary pressure. Everything that follows every creature named and described in the hours ahead is an expression of that logic, pursued without direction or intention, for as long as the conditions that drive it persist. Section 3. Ghouls. The human face of radiation. Of all the transformations that the post-war world produced through the patient and indifferent application of radiation to living tissue, none carries the particular philosophical weight of ghoulification, and the reason for this is not difficult to identify. The Deathclaw and the Rad Scorpion and the Mirelurk are alarming in their physical capabilities and significant in their ecological roles, but they do not ask anything of the person who encounters them beyond a tactical assessment of the immediate threat they represent. They are creatures. They can be understood as creatures, engaged as creatures, and their existence, however dramatic in its specifics, does not force any fundamental reconsideration of what the world is or what it contains. A ghoul is different. A ghoul is a person who has been through something, and the something they have been through has not, in the cases that matter most, removed the person. It has simply changed the body that the person inhabits, and left the person inside it with full knowledge of what that change cost, and full memory of what existed before it. The process by which a human being ghoulifies is not, even 2 centuries after the Great War, fully understood by the wasteland's available scientific minds. This is not for lack of interest or lack of subjects. Ghouls are among the most common transformed beings in the post-war world, present in every region that absorbs significant fallout, and in the ruins of virtually every major pre-war settlement, but for lack of the institutional scientific infrastructure that systematic study would require. What is known is that ghoulification is not the inevitable outcome of radiation exposure. The overwhelming majority of human beings who receive significant radiation doses in the post-war world simply die of it, in the pattern of progressive biological failure that acute and chronic radiation sickness follow. A smaller number survive their exposure through the conventional means: Radaway, Rad-X, shielding, distance, luck, and carry their accumulated radiation burden forward as a silent biological debt without transforming. And a smaller number still, through a combination of factors that includes radiation dose and duration, but that clearly involves other variables that have not been isolated, undergo a transformation rather than a deterioration. Their cells do not fail under the radiation's pressure. They adapt to it, and the adaptation is radical, comprehensive, and irreversible. What ghoulification produces at the physical level is a body that has been restructured at the cellular and tissue level to process ionizing radiation as a component of its biological function rather than as a threat to it. The skin becomes leathery and desiccated, losing the suppleness and moisture retention of healthy human tissue as the cellular structures responsible for maintaining it are repurposed toward radiation processing. The hair is lost entirely, a consequence of the same follicular restructuring. The facial features are altered progressively as the ongoing physiological changes that ghoulification sets in motion continue across years and decades, the bones of the face changing slowly, the soft tissues adapting to conditions that the pre-war body was never designed to manage, producing the distinctive appearance that every wasteland inhabitant learns to recognize and that most learn, in their first encounter, to fear before they have any basis for that fear beyond the appearance itself. The eyes develop a luminous quality, a dim inner light that reflects the radiation that the ghoulified body absorbs and uses rather than suffers. A ghoul who enters a heavily irradiated environment does not reach for radaway. They do not need to. The radiation that would be measurably damaging to an unghoulified person within a few minutes of exposure is, for a ghoul, something closer to sustenance, not painful, not dangerous, simply ambient, the ordinary quality of an environment that their biology has been rebuilt to inhabit. What ghoulification does not alter, and this is the fact around which everything else about the ghoul condition is organized, is the mind. Not consistently, not reliably, not universally, but in the cases that define the most significant aspect of the ghoul's presence in the wasteland. The transformation of the body does not carry with it any corresponding transformation of the person who lives within that body. An intelligent ghoul retains complete continuity of their memories, their personality, their emotional responses, their capacity for language and abstract reasoning, and the full range of social and intellectual functions that characterized them before the radiation did its work. They wake up in a body they may no longer fully recognize, with every thought and feeling and recollection they possessed before the change, and they carry those thoughts and feelings and recollections forward into whatever comes next. They are, in the most precise and meaningful sense available to the concept, the same person they were before ghoulification. The body is different, the person is not. The practical consequence of this is that the wasteland contains people who have been alive for 200 years. People who remember October 23rd, 2077, not as history transmitted through documents and stories, and the fragmentary material evidence of a civilization reduced to ruins, but as a morning, a specific morning, with a specific quality of light, and a specific set of ordinary concerns, and a specific moment when the sirens sounded and everything changed. These people stood in the world that existed before the bombs, and they watched what the bombs did to it, and they survived into the world that followed, and they have been living in that following world for every year of the 2 centuries that have passed since. The grief this represents is genuine and without precedent, because human beings were not previously designed to outlive not just the people they loved, but the entire civilization within which those people existed, the entire system of meaning and reference and shared understanding that gave individual lives their context and their texture. A person who ghoulified in their 30s, in 2077, has watched everyone they ever knew die. They have watched their friends' children grow old and die. They have watched their friends' grandchildren grow old and die. They have watched the settlements that replaced the cities they grew up in rise and fall and be replaced in turn. And they carry the weight of all of this not as historical knowledge but as personal experience, as the content of a memory that does not fade or soften with time in the way that the psychological literature of the pre-war world had suggested that grief eventually did. Raul Tejada survived the bombing as a young man in Mexico City, where the strikes were less comprehensive than in the major North American population centers, but sufficient to destroy the world he had known and kill most of the people who had inhabited it alongside him. He lived through the subsequent 2 centuries as a wandering mechanic and gunslinger, accumulating losses with the slow inevitability of someone who has simply been present long enough that loss is the dominant feature of the landscape. By the time he was encountered in the Mojave, working as a reluctant handyman at a raider stronghold rather than as anything resembling a participant in the wasteland's broader social life, he had achieved the specific emotional withdrawal of someone who had learned, across a very long time and through a very large number of specific, painful experiments, that attachment to other people was a cost he was no longer certain he could sustain. He was not broken, his competence was intact, his humor was intact, his fundamental decency was intact, but he was old in a way that had no pre-war parallel, and the oldness was not in his body, but in the weight of what his memory contained. Hancock, the ghoul who made himself the mayor and informal guardian of good neighbor in the Commonwealth, arrived at his ghoulhood through a path that was almost the opposite of Raoul's slow accumulation of radiation-driven transformation. He chose it, or as close to chose as a decision made in desperation and chemical extremity can constitute a choice. He was, before his transformation, a politician, a man who had worked within the systems of the Commonwealth's human settlements and found those systems inadequate to his sense of what justice required, and who had eventually concluded that the constraints his humanity placed on his options were themselves part of the problem. He consumed a cocktail of experimental chems and radiation in a single accelerated process and emerged from the experience ghoulified, scarred, and in his own account, liberated, freed from the particular set of limitations that the pre-ghoulified version of himself had been unable to escape. The community he built in Goodneighbor was the expression of this liberation, a settlement organized around the explicit principle that the transformations the wasteland worked on human beings were not disqualifying, that what a person looked like was not a meaningful statement about what they deserved, and that the margins of the human community were as deserving of protection and dignity as its center. Hancock inhabited his ghoulhood with an energy that looked, from the outside, like recklessness, and that was, from the inside, something more considered, the fierce engagement with existence of someone who had decided that the terms of their survival were going to be their own. Among the variants of the ghoul condition, the glowing one occupies a position of particular significance in the wasteland's ecology. Glowing ones are ghouls who have absorbed quantities of radiation so far beyond the standard ghoulification threshold that their bodies emit it visibly, the ionizing particles that their biology processes, accumulating to levels that produce the distinctive blue-green luminescence that identifies them at a distance, and that makes proximity to them dangerous for any unshielded person whose body does not share their capacity for radiation processing. In physical capability, glowing ones are among the most formidable of the ghoul variants. Their extreme radiation absorption having produced biological changes beyond the standard transformation that increase their resilience and their physical effectiveness in ways that make them significantly more dangerous in direct engagement than standard ghouls. But the most ecologically significant characteristic of the glowing one is not its individual threat profile. It is the effect that its presence has on other ghouls in its vicinity. Glowing ones appear capable of revitalizing other ghouls, particularly feral ghouls whose biological systems have been depleted by damage or extended deprivation, restoring function to organisms that would otherwise be incapacitated. Whether this represents a form of communication, an instinctive biological radiation sharing process, or something more complex that the wasteland's scientific understanding has not developed adequate vocabulary to describe, is a question that remains genuinely open. What is not open is the tactical implication. A glowing one in the vicinity of a group of feral ghouls is not simply one additional threat, but a force multiplier for every other threat in that group. and the experienced wasteland traveler learns to prioritize accordingly. The feral ghoul is the aspect of the ghoul condition that haunts every intelligent ghoul's existence, because every intelligent ghoul knows that what a feral ghoul is what they might become. At some point, through mechanisms that the wasteland science has identified as involving cumulative radiation exposure beyond some critical threshold, but that may also involve psychological factors. The progressive exhaustion of the cognitive resources that maintain personal identity across centuries of compounding loss. Some ghouls lose the functions that distinguish a person from an organism driven by instinct and hunger. The transition does not follow a single predictable course. Some intelligent ghouls, who maintained full cognitive function for decades and whose behavior gave no indication of deterioration, underwent the change with a suddenness that provided no adequate warning to those around them. Others deteriorated slowly enough that those who knew them could observe the process, watching the moments of confusion become more frequent. The personality they had known for years begin to fragment and simplify. The emotional range narrow, and the behavioral repertoire reduced to the drives that were all that remained when everything else had fallen away. What is left when the transition completes is a body that is still identifiably human in its general form, bipedal, roughly human proportioned, possessed of hands, and a face that the wanderer approaching it will recognize as a face before they recognize anything else about it, but that is animated by nothing that the person who occupied that body would recognize as continuous with their experience. The feral ghoul that moves through the ruins of a settlement toward a traveler it has identified as prey was someone, and in most cases the ruins it inhabits are ruins it knew when they were not ruins, and it moves through them with no awareness of this fact. And the combination of these truths is among the more quietly devastating features of the post-war world's daily texture. The social reality of ghouls in the wasteland's human communities is defined by a discrimination that is visceral and immediate rather than reasoned, and that traces back not to any specific argument about ghoul capabilities or behavior, but to the most ancient and unreflective of human threat responses. The instinctive reading of physical abnormality as a signal of disease, contamination, and danger. A ghoul's appearance triggers something in the unghoulified human nervous system that precedes any cognitive assessment of the individual in question. And in the wasteland's threat environment, where the instinct to treat unfamiliar biological signals as dangerous has been reinforced by 2 centuries of encounters in which that instinct was correct, there are few social mechanisms adequate to override it. Diamond City maintained formal policies restricting ghoul residency for years. Policies that were understood by their architects not as expressions of principled exclusion, but as practical responses to the discomfort of the settlement's human population, a discomfort that was recognized as potentially irrational and maintained anyway, because in a community organized around the protection its walls provided, the management of its inhabitants' sense of safety was a political necessity that outweighed the claims of individuals whose presence disturbed it. Smaller settlements refused entry to ghouls entirely, without the institutional deliberation that Diamond City's policy represented, simply shot on sight, in many cases, by guards whose threat assessment protocols did not include a step for distinguishing between intelligent and feral. The ghoul traveler approaching an unfamiliar settlement operates therefore in a condition of genuine uncertainty about the most basic question their approach involves, which is whether the people inside those walls are going to recognize them as a person seeking shelter or respond to their appearance before anything else can be established. This uncertainty shapes every aspect of how intelligent ghouls navigate the wasteland's human geography: the careful approach at visible distance, the deliberate display of non-threatening posture, and the active suppression of behaviors that might be misread, the management of communication from far enough away that the person receiving it has time to process the words before the proximity of the speaker triggers the response that proximity alone might otherwise produce. It is an exhausting and perpetually precarious way to move through a world that one has survived long enough to have helped build. And the ghouls, who navigate it with the patience and the continued willingness to seek human community that it demands, are doing so in the full knowledge of all the times that the same effort was rewarded with violence rather than welcome. Good Neighbor stands as the most significant counterexample to this pattern, a community that did not merely tolerate ghouls, but organized its foundational identity around the rejection of the premise that physical transformation was disqualifying. But Good Neighbor was one settlement, and the wasteland was large. And the ghoul, who walked the road between settlements in regions where Good Neighbor's philosophy had not spread, was walking it under the same conditions as every other ghoul who had ever walked a road toward a settlement whose response they could not predict. The weight of that uncertainty accumulated across the years and decades and centuries that the long-lived among them had been carrying it, was itself a form of transformation, not of the body, but of the relationship between the person and the world they inhabited. The slow and costly recalibration of what it was reasonable to expect from the humans who shared that world and what it was necessary to accept that they would not provide. Section 4. Super mutants, FEVs, most recognizable children. If the ghoul represents the most philosophically complex of the wasteland's transformed beings, the transformation that raises the most difficult questions about personhood and continuity, because it preserves the person most completely within the changed body. Then, the super mutant represents something almost its mirror image, the transformation that is most comprehensive, most visible, and most thoroughly documented across every region of the post-war world, but that, in the majority of cases, erases rather than preserves the person it starts from. The ghoul is recognizably human in appearance and sometimes alien in experience. The super mutant is alien in appearance and sometimes, in the cases that matter most, recognizably human in experience. Both demand more from the wasteland's inhabitants than a simple threat assessment allows, but they demand it in different ways, and the difference illuminates something important about what the forced evolutionary virus actually did to the world it was released into. The origins of the super mutant populations that would come to define the threat profile of every major wasteland region lay not in the post-war period, but in the years immediately before the bombs fell. In the research conducted at the Mariposa military base, under the auspices of the United States Army's interest in the forced evolutionary virus, the subjects who entered the Mariposa vats in those final pre-war years did not leave them as they had entered. The virus restructured their bodies along the lines its code specified, producing dramatic increases in physical size and strength. Elimination of the biological vulnerabilities that made unmodified human beings susceptible to the radiation and chemical threats of a post-nuclear battlefield, and a comprehensive restructuring of the immune and endocrine systems that produced an organism far more physically resilient than anything the natural selection of human evolutionary history had generated. It also produced, in the majority of cases, a significant reduction in the cognitive complexity that had made those same people human in the most practically meaningful sense. The loss of the higher order thinking, the emotional range, the social and psychological subtlety that distinguished human consciousness from the more direct and reactive cognitive styles of other animals. The bodies that emerged from the Mariposa vats were formidable. The people who had entered them were, in most cases, substantially diminished or gone entirely. Richard Fontaine was, before his encounter with the forced evolutionary virus, a man of genuine intellectual sophistication, a university-educated researcher whose engagement with questions of evolutionary biology and the philosophy of human development had given him a framework for understanding what the virus was and what it could be made to do. His exposure to FEV at Mariposa did not follow the standard pattern of cognitive reduction. It produced instead something that was not straightforwardly enhancement, but not straightforwardly diminishment, either a transformation of his cognitive architecture that preserved and in certain respects amplified his intellectual capabilities, while introducing a psychological fracture so deep and so comprehensive that the being who emerged from the experience could no longer be considered continuous with the person who had entered it in any sense beyond the biological. He became the master, a being of exceptional intelligence and profound instability, capable of the sophisticated long-range planning and ideological synthesis that the standard super-mutant could not manage, but operating from a psychological foundation so damaged that the plan he developed and prosecuted was built on a premise he had not adequately examined, and that contained within it the seed of its own complete undoing. The master's plan was, in its own terms, coherent. He had observed the post-war world with the clarity that his transformed intelligence permitted and arrived at conclusions that were not individually unreasonable. The human body, as it existed in the post-war landscape, was poorly suited to that landscape's conditions, vulnerable to the radiation that permeated it, susceptible to the biological and chemical hazards that 2 centuries of environmental transformation had produced, dependent on resources that the wasteland could not reliably provide. The super-mutant body was, by comparison, robustly adapted to precisely those conditions, resistant to radiation, capable of sustaining injuries that would be fatal to unmodified humans, requiring less of the environment to maintain its function. The logical extension of these observations, in the Master's framework, was that the transformation of humanity into super-mutanthood was not destruction, but improvement, not genocide, but evolution, accelerated by deliberate intervention in the direction that the post-war world's selection pressures were already pointing. He prosecuted this vision with genuine conviction and considerable organizational capability, building an army and establishing the infrastructure to pursue his program at a scale that represented the most significant organized threat to human settlement in California in the post-war period. The plan's fatal flaw was one that the Master's considerable intelligence had not adequately addressed, and the reason it had not been adequately addressed was that the psychological fracture at the center of his transformed consciousness had made certain kinds of honest self-examination impossible for him. Supermutants produced by the Mariposa FEV strain are sterile. The virus's restructuring of the host genome produces an organism that is physically powerful and biologically resilient, but that cannot reproduce sexually, a consequence of the comprehensive genetic rewriting that the transformation involves, which eliminates the biological mechanisms through which sexual reproduction is organized, along with everything else it rewrites. The Master was building a civilization that could produce no next generation. Every supermutant his army created through the forced mutation of captured humans was the last of their line, not a founder of a new humanity, but a biological terminus, a being whose physical capabilities would end with their own death because nothing they were could be passed forward in the way that the continuation of any species required. When this was demonstrated to the Master, when the contradiction between his stated goal and the biological reality of the organism he was creating with such comprehensive effort was made undeniable, the psychological fracture that had always been at the center of his transformed consciousness finally consumed what remained of his organizational coherence. He destroyed himself and his installation, and the army he had built dispersed or was defeated by the combined efforts of the wasteland's human communities, and California's supermutant population became a residual presence rather than an existential threat. The Vault 87 strain, which produced the supermutant population of the capital wasteland, was a different variant of FEV, acting on a different population under different conditions, and the results it produced were different in character from the Mariposa strain in ways that reflected each of those distinctions. Vault 87 was one of the most completely betrayed of all the vaults, a facility whose experimental protocol involved exposing its inhabitants to FEV almost immediately after the doors closed, not as the culmination of a research program, but as its entire purpose, with the inhabitant population serving as the raw material from which the virus's effects in a sealed environment could be studied. The people who had walked into Vault 87 carrying their single permitted bag and believing they were entering a sanctuary from the bombs became, within a short time of the doors closing, the founding population of the super mutant army that would terrorize the capital wasteland for the next 2 centuries. The Vault 87 strain produces super mutants who are, by most assessments, more immediately aggressive and somewhat less cognitively capable even than the Mariposa baseline, a consequence of the specific characteristics of the strain, combined with the pre-irradiated state of the population it acted upon. The people of Vault 87, having been exposed to the significant ambient radiation of the Vault's location before the FEV transformation began. These super mutants perpetuated their numbers not through vats that they could operate independently, but through the capture of surface humans from the capital wasteland, whom they dragged back to the Vault's processing facilities for forced mutation, a continuation of the process that had produced them, now operated by the transformed rather than the transformers, with a comprehension of the mechanism involved that was not scientific, but simply behavioral. They knew that the vats made more of them. They used the vats to make more of them. The sophistication of this understanding was limited, and it was sufficient. The behemoths of the capital wasteland represent the extreme end of what the Vault 87 strain produces when the transformation continues beyond the standard super mutant endpoint. They are super mutants who have kept mutating, whose biology did not stabilize at the standard super mutant configuration, but continued to change over years and decades, producing organisms of a physical scale that exceeds the standard super mutant as dramatically as the standard super mutant exceeds an unmodified human. 5 behemoths were documented in the capital wasteland at the time the lone wanderer moved through it. Each had established a territory and a behavioral pattern that reflected its individual history, and each represented a tactical challenge so far beyond what standard super mutant encounters required that experienced wasteland travelers planned specific responses to behemoth encounters in the way they planned responses to Deathclaw. Encounters with the specific and serious recognition that the standard approach to a dangerous situation would be inadequate, and that inadequacy in this particular context was not survivable. Against this backdrop of cognitive reduction and physical excess, Fawkes stands as one of the most significant individuals in the capital wasteland's documented history, a Vault 87 super mutant who retained full intelligence and a personality that encompassed genuine kindness, philosophical reflection, and the particular emotional warmth of someone who had survived extraordinary isolation without losing their fundamental orientation toward other beings as worthy of care and connection. Fawkes had lived for years in isolation within the Vault, confined to a single containment cell by the other super mutants who recognized his difference from them without understanding it, subsisting on the reading material he had been able to access through the terminal in his cell and on the inner resources that his retained intelligence made available to him. His encounter with the lone wanderer, who opened his cell and spoke to him as a person rather than assessing him as a threat, was not merely a practical alliance but an event of genuine significance for both parties. The meeting of 2 individuals who had each been navigating a world that provided inadequate recognition of what they actually were, and who found in each other a form of acknowledgement that the wasteland did not distribute generously. The Institute's super mutant population, which represented the Commonwealth's primary super mutant presence, was produced through a different process than either the Mariposa or Vault 87 strains, not the legacy of pre-war military research or Vault experimentation, but the active post-war scientific program of an institution that had access to FEV synthesis capability and that chose to use it. The Institute's scientists had reconstructed the forced evolutionary virus from preserved research documentation and had synthesized their own variant, which they used to transform humans abducted from the Commonwealth surface as part of their broader research into biological modification and the limits of human physical transformation. The Institute's approach to this work was methodical in the way that all their scientific activity was methodical, documented, analyzed, subjected to the rigorous internal evaluation that their institutional culture demanded of all research programs, and this methodological rigor did not diminish in any way the moral catastrophe that the work represented. The surface people who were taken and transformed had no more choice in the matter than the inhabitants of Vault 87 had had in theirs. The difference was that the Institute could not claim the fog of institutional betrayal and governmental conspiracy that surrounded the Vault program. The Institute knew exactly what it was doing to the people it was doing it to, and it considered that knowledge a component of good scientific practice rather than a reason to reconsider. Strong, the Commonwealth super mutant encountered in the ruins of the Old World's Massachusetts had retained enough cognitive function and developed enough independent philosophical curiosity to organize his existence around a search whose object he could not precisely name or locate. He had encountered a fragment of a pre-war play William Shakespeare's work, surviving in the wasteland in the way that many pre-war texts survived, in pieces, in contexts that stripped them of the interpretive framework that gave them their full meaning, and had extracted from that fragment a concept that his super mutant mind had turned into a quest, the milk of human kindness. He did not understand it as a metaphor. He understood it as a thing that existed somewhere in the world, a substance or a quality or a power that would make him stronger than he already was, and he was looking for it with the single-minded intensity that his transformed biology directed toward objectives it had identified as important. The tragedy and the tenderness of Strong's situation lay in the gap between what he was looking for and what the phrase he was looking for it from actually meant the possibility that what he was seeking was something his. Transformation had made more difficult to find precisely because the thing itself was constituted by the cognitive and emotional qualities that the forced evolutionary virus had most comprehensively diminished in him. Virgil was, before his self-inflicted FEV exposure, an institute scientist of significant standing, a researcher whose expertise and whose institutional position gave him access to the information that eventually made him too dangerous to be permitted to remain within the FAR Institute's walls. He chose to infect himself with the Institute's FEV strain rather than face whatever the Institute had planned for people who knew too much about its operations. And he survived the transformation into a super mutant with enough of his scientific knowledge intact to understand precisely what had been done to his biology and what would be required to reverse it. He spent years in the glowing sea, the most heavily irradiated region of the Commonwealth, where the radiation levels were sufficient to kill an unmodified human in hours, but that a super mutant's biology could sustain indefinitely conducting research in the worst possible conditions toward the goal of synthesizing a serum that could partially reverse the FEV transformation. That he eventually succeeded, however incompletely, was a testament to what a functioning scientific mind could accomplish, even housed in a dramatically different body than the one that had done most of its foundational training. Virgil remains the only documented case of intentional FEV reversal in the wasteland's history, and the partiality of his success. The serum restored some human characteristics, but not a full return to his pre-transformation state, is itself a meaningful data point about the completeness and comprehensiveness of what FEV does at the biological level. In the mountains and valleys of Appalachia, the super mutants who emerged from the pre-war experimentation at Huntersville represented a distinct expression of FEV's transformative potential, a population whose origins lay not in military vat installations or vault experiments, but in the systematic exposure of a civilian community to an experimental compound introduced without their knowledge or consent by a partnership of pre-war corporate and military interests who had identified region's population as a suitable research cohort because of its geographic isolation and its distance from the oversight mechanisms that operated in more visible communities. The Appalachian super-mutants organized themselves in the post-war period into communities with functional social structures, demonstrating again that the cognitive reduction associated with the FEV transformation was a tendency rather than an absolute determination, that what the virus did to the minds it encountered was severe and consistent in its general direction but not uniform in every individual case, and that the individuals who retained more function than the transformation typically allowed could, in the right circumstances and with the social organization that their retained capabilities made possible, build something that deserved to be called a community rather than simply a population. Marcus had built a version of this across his long, post-transformation life, not a super mutant community specifically, but a presence within human communities that was defined by what he offered rather than by what the standard assessment of his kind suggested he was likely to do. His equanimity about his transformed state was not the absence of grief, but the settled residue of grief that had run its full course across enough decades that what remained on the other side was something he had found adequate language for, if not full resolution. He remembered who he had been before the transformation. He remembered it clearly enough to understand precisely what the distance was between that person and the one who now walked through the world in this body. The wisdom he had developed in the intervening years was genuine, rooted in the specific experience of having been remade and having had to learn what the new version of himself was capable of and what it was not, and having found in that learning something that could be offered to the people who encountered him and who were willing to receive it. He asked for very little in return. He had learned, across a very long time, that asking for too much from people who were not sure what category to place you in was a form of self-punishment that served no one. What the super-mutant populations of the wasteland collectively represent, across their regional variations and their individual exceptions, is the most dramatic expression of the forced evolutionary virus's fundamental character, its capacity to take the biological complexity of a human being and restructure it according to specifications that had nothing to do with the wishes or welfare of the person being restructured, producing an organism that was in many respects more suited to the wasteland's conditions than the human it had replaced, and that, in the majority of cases, could not be considered continuous with that human in any meaningful sense. And yet, the exceptions to this majority, Fawkes, Strong, Virgil, Marcus, Lily Bowen carrying her grandchildren's voices in her memory across 2 centuries of violence and transformation, are not statistical noise. They are evidence that what the virus destroyed in most of its subjects was not something that the virus made it impossible to retain, but something that the conditions of each individual transformation either preserved or eliminated based on factors that no one has yet been able to fully map or predict. In every super mutant army, in every population of transformed beings scattered across the wasteland's regions, the possibility existed that one of them was still someone. And the wasteland's history, at its most human, has sometimes been the story of the encounters in which that possibility was recognized in time to matter. Section 5. Deathclaws, the apex of an engineered ecology. There is a particular quality to the silence that precedes a Deathclaws approach that experienced wasteland travelers describe with a consistency, suggesting the experience is not merely individual, but something closer to universal. A quality of absence that is distinguishable from ordinary quiet in the way that a held breath is distinguishable from easy breathing, characterized not by the presence of any specific threatening sound, but by the sudden cessation of all the ambient sounds that a living landscape normally produces. The birds stop, the insects stop. Whatever small mammals had been moving through the brush at the edge of the traveler's awareness stop, and the silence that fills the space they vacated has a weight and a texture that the body registers before the mind has assembled the available information into a conscious conclusion about what is producing it. The Deathclaw has not made itself known. It is simply present in the landscape in a way that every other organism in that landscape has already responded to, and the traveler who has not yet learned to read this particular quality of silence is the last living thing in the vicinity to understand what it means. The Deathclaw is among the most successful organisms the post-war world has produced, and its success is not incidental, but rooted in the specific combination of physical capability, behavioral intelligence, and ecological adaptability that its origins and its subsequent centuries of natural selection have produced. It did not arrive at this position through the gradual pressure of radiation alone, as the rad scorpion and the bloatfly did. It was engineered the product of a deliberate pre-war military research program that had identified the need for biological weapons capable of operating effectively in a post-nuclear environment without the supply chain, requirements that mechanical weapons imposed, and that had selected the Jackson's chameleon as the base organism upon which the forced evolutionary virus would do its work. The program's architects specified the parameters of the transformation they wanted: an organism of greater physical mass and strength, possessed of enhanced sensory capabilities and aggressive territorial behavior, capable of navigating difficult terrain at speed and engaging human-sized targets with lethal effectiveness. The FEV delivered all of this, and then, as it had done in every other application the pre-war military had made of it, exceeded the specifications so comprehensively that the program's success and its disaster were functionally the same event. The creatures that emerged from the program's experimental phase were effective beyond any parameter that had been specified. They were also completely impossible to control or direct, and the distinction between a biological weapon that could be aimed and a biological weapon that could not be aimed was one that the program's designers had perhaps not weighted adequately in their initial assessments. When the Deathclaws escaped or were released in the chaos of the war's final period, by personnel who may have intended this as a tactical action, or may simply have been unable to maintain containment as the infrastructure around them failed, they moved into the post-war landscape and found, in its specific conditions, precisely the environment that their engineered capabilities were suited to exploit. 2 centuries later, they have not merely survived in that landscape. They have organized it around themselves, establishing themselves so thoroughly at the apex of its predator hierarchy that the settlements and travel routes and human geographies of every region they inhabit have been shaped in relation to their presence in ways that would not have existed without them. A fully mature Deathclaw stands nearly 3 meters in height, bipedal, with a physical build that distributes the mass of its body across a frame of extraordinary structural integrity. Its forelimbs are equipped with claws, whose length and curvature and structural composition make them capable of penetrating the outer plating of military-grade power armor, the most robust personal protective equipment that the CO pre-war world produced, designed specifically to make its wearer resistant to the weapons of a nuclear battlefield, with enough residual force to cause catastrophic damage to whatever the armor was protecting. Its hind limbs provide the mechanical basis for a speed of movement across difficult terrain that its size suggests should be impossible, a legacy of the chameleon heritage that the FEV preserved and amplified rather than eliminated, retaining the lizard's extraordinary mechanical efficiency of locomotion within a body plan that is 30 times the chameleon's mass. The exterior surface of a mature Deathclaw is not simply tough skin, but something that functions as biological armor layered, structured tissue whose composition resists penetration in ways that make conventional small arms fire ineffective against the frontal surfaces, redirecting kinetic energy in the way that engineered armor redirects it, rather than simply absorbing it as living tissue normally does. The sensory apparatus that the Deathclaw brings to its navigation of the wasteland is exceptional across multiple modalities simultaneously. Its hearing operates at a range and a sensitivity that makes sound-based concealment from it extremely difficult. The wasteland traveler, whose footstep on loose rubble carries 100 meters in still air, is not making a sound that a Deathclaw at that distance fails to register. Its olfactory capability maps the chemical landscape of its territory with a comprehensiveness that allows it to track prey that has long since moved beyond its line of sight. And it possesses a sensitivity to ground vibration transmitted through the substrate. It moves across that functions effectively as a form of seismic awareness, the Deathclaw that cannot see or smell a target at a particular moment may still know that target is present and approximately where, through the physical information that the target's movement writes into the ground between them. The combination of these sensory systems means that for a traveler who has entered Deathclaw territory without specialized knowledge or equipment, the Deathclaw is aware of their presence before they are aware of its, and the encounter that follows begins from a position of informational asymmetry so complete that it functions as a tactical determination before any tactical decision has been made. Deathclaws are not solitary predators. This is perhaps the most significant single fact about them beyond their individual physical capabilities, because it means that encountering one Deathclaw in a territory is an encounter with the full social structure that one Deathclaw represents: the alpha pair, the offspring at various developmental stages, the territorial hierarchy that the family group maintains and defends. They organize themselves into family units whose internal relationships are complex enough to involve differentiated roles and consistent behavioral patterns across individuals. And they defend the territories these units occupy with a comprehensiveness that makes those territories effectively impassable for human travelers without the specific military capability required to engage the full group. Simultaneously, the alpha pair within any Deathclaw family group occupies a threat category above the standard adults, distinguished not merely by physical size, though they are typically the largest individuals in the group, but by the combination of territorial authority and combat experience that their status reflects. An alpha Deathclaw defending its territory is not simply a large Deathclaw, but a Deathclaw operating with the full motivational intensity of an organism whose fundamental biological investments are at stake. Mother Deathclaws, protecting nests and hatchlings, represent perhaps the most tactically dangerous encounters in any regional wasteland, precisely because maternal defense behavior removes whatever residual caution might otherwise inflect a Deathclaw's engagement with intruders. A standard adult Deathclaw may, in certain circumstances, register the threat profile of a prepared and well-armed group of travelers and make a behavioral calculation that results in territorial display rather than direct attack, not because it lacks the capability for the attack, because its behavioral system retains enough tactical flexibility to distinguish between threats it can eliminate and threats whose elimination would be costly. A mother Deathclaw near a nest does not make this calculation. The behavior is not tactical but absolute, and its absoluteness in a creature of that physical capability is the most dangerous thing that the Wasteland's encounter roster routinely presents. The Mojave Wasteland, in the period documented by the records of the courier's movements through it, supported a Deathclaw population centered around Quarry Junction and the surrounding terrain that represented the densest concentration of the species, documented anywhere in the available records. The quarry itself had become the focal point of a territorial organization so extensive and so thoroughly maintained that the caravan routes through the region had been rerouted around it years before the courier arrived. The practical determination having been made by the communities that depended on those routes that the cost in lives and time of passing through Quarry Junction was not supportable, regardless of the directness of the path it offered. The Deathclaws had not driven the caravans away through any purposeful strategic action. They had simply been there, and their being there in those numbers and with that territorial intensity had been sufficient. Among the regional variants that the Wasteland's Deathclaw populations produced through the combination of genetic diversity and local environmental pressure, the albino Deathclaw documented in the capital wasteland, represented a mutation that distinguished itself from the standard population, not merely in the coloration that named it, but in the physical characteristics that accompanied that distinction: harder, faster, with a threat profile elevated sufficiently above the already extreme standard that the experienced capital wasteland travelers who documented their encounters treated it as a categorically different problem rather than simply a more dangerous version of a familiar one. The chameleon Deathclaw, documented in multiple regions, retained a functional version of the ancestral camouflage capability that the Jackson's chameleon had possessed, and that the FEV transformation had preserved rather than eliminated partial visual transparency that made detection before engagement genuinely difficult in the already challenging conditions of the wasteland's varied terrain. And that gave the encounter with one of these individuals the particular quality of a danger that the traveler's senses had repeatedly failed to register before the failure became consequential. The intelligent Deathclaws, documented in the vicinity of Vault 13 in California, represent perhaps the most philosophically significant chapter in the Deathclaws' post-war history, and the chapter whose ending most clearly illuminates the particular moral character of the Enclave's operations in the region. A population of Deathclaws had, in the years following the Master's defeat, developed genuine intelligence, not the behavioral complexity and pack coordination that all Deathclaw populations displayed, but something qualitatively different. Language, the capacity for abstract reasoning, the ability to form and pursue long-term social goals that required understanding of other minds and their likely responses to proposed actions. These intelligent Deathclaws had established themselves within Vault 13, not as invaders but as residents, maintaining the Vault's systems with the practical competence their intelligence made available to them, and organizing their social life according to principles they had developed through the application of that intelligence to the specific problems their existence presented. They were, in the only sense of the term that had ever mattered in practice, a community. They sought recognition from the new California Republic not as a tactical maneuver, but as a genuine appeal for the acknowledgement that their intelligence constituted personhood sufficient to generate the protections that the extended Republic's founding principles associated with personhood. The Enclave eliminated them before any such recognition was established, and with their elimination went the only documented instance of Deathclaw intelligence developing naturally in the post-war world, a possibility that the wasteland had produced once, through the same processes of radiation and time and environmental pressure that had produced everything else it had made, and that the Enclave's operations removed from the world before the world had fully understood what it was looking at. What the Deathclaw represents, 2 centuries after the military program that produced it was destroyed along with everything else the Great War consumed, is the most complete expression of what happens when an engineered organism is released into an environment it was designed for, and then left entirely alone for long enough that the engineering becomes indistinguishable from natural. History. The Deathclaw is not a weapon any longer. It has not been a weapon since the day it escaped its program's containment and entered the wasteland on its own terms. It is a predator, an apex presence in a transformed ecology, a creature whose territorial intelligence and social organization and physical capability are not evidence of what pre-war science intended, but of what 2 centuries of natural selection acting on the product of that science produced, when there was no longer anyone in a position to direct the outcome. Its pre-war origin is historical fact. Its present reality is the wasteland, and it belongs to that reality as completely as anything in it. Section 6. The irradiated insect world. Radroaches, bloatflies, fire ants, radscorpions, cazadores, and the creatures that inherited the earth. Before the bombs fell, the most successful organisms on the North American continent were not the large mammals that occupied the landscape's most visible ecological roles. They were the insects. They had been the most successful organisms on the continent for 350 million years, before the first human civilization produced its first written record. And they had maintained that success through every extinction event and every climatic shift and every geological transformation that the continent's history had imposed upon them. Because the qualities that made them successful were not the qualities that the large, the complex, and the cognitively sophisticated possessed, but the qualities that the small, the numerous, and the biologically ancient possessed: a cellular simplicity that interacted with radiation differently from the complex multicellular architectures of vertebrate life, a reproductive rate that allowed populations to recover from catastrophic reduction within a single season, a metabolic flexibility that permitted survival on resources that larger organisms could not process, and the capacity to exist in numbers so vast that the elimination of most of the population left a residual sufficient to begin again. When the bombs fell, the insects of North America experienced what every other class of organism experienced: massive initial mortality, disruption of ecological relationships, exposure to ionizing radiation in quantities that would have been fatal to any individual not possessed of the specific biological characteristics that allowed survival. And then, in the decades and generations that followed, they did what they had always done when conditions changed around them. They adapted. They grew. The wasteland that the Great War produced was, in ways that the pre-war world's designers of that war had not considered, fundamentally an insect world, and the human beings and larger animals who moved through it did so in an environment that the insects had reorganized around their own requirements before any of the larger organisms had finished processing the initial shock of what had happened. The radroach is the creature that most wasteland inhabitants encounter before they encounter almost anything else, and this priority of encounter is itself ecologically informative. The cockroach, from which the radroach descends, was among the most radiation-resistant organisms that the pre-war biological world contained, a creature whose simple and extraordinarily ancient cellular architecture interacted with ionizing radiation in ways that more complex organisms could not match, repairing molecular damage at rates that allowed survival of exposures that would have been lethal to any vertebrate. This pre-war advantage became, in the post-war world, the foundation for a transformation that radiation could accelerate more efficiently in the cockroach lineage than in almost any other organism exposed to the same pressures. The radroach that a vault dweller encounters upon opening a sealed chamber that has been undisturbed for 2 centuries is significantly larger than any cockroach its pre-war ancestors could have produced, capable of growing to a fast size that makes it a genuine, if individually modest, physical hazard, with a resilience to environmental radiation that exceeds even the extraordinary tolerance of its pre-war lineage. It is, by most meaningful measures, better suited to the world it inhabits than the cockroach was to the world that preceded it, and its ubiquity in every enclosed space the wasteland contains, the vaults, the ruins, the basements and sewers and collapsed structures of every pre-war settlement, reflects not a failure to be displaced by the changing world, but a successful exploitation of the new world's specific opportunities. The radroach's ecological function is primarily that of decomposer and scavenger, processing the organic waste and dead material that the wasteland generates in quantities that no other decomposition mechanism could address at comparable scale. This function is not glamorous, and it is not threatening in the way that the wasteland's more dramatic hazards are threatening, but it is ecologically foundational. The nutrient cycling that the radroach performs is a component of the soil and substrate chemistry that everything growing in the wasteland depends upon, and a world without radroaches would be a world in which the dead accumulated rather than returning to the biological cycle in the form that living things could use. The individual radroach, assessed in isolation from this function, is a nuisance and occasionally a minor hazard. The radroach population, assessed in its full ecological role, is one of the organisms that makes the wasteland's continued biological function possible, and the traveler who dispatches a basement full of them with contemptuous efficiency is not wrong to do so, and is also, without knowing it, participating in a relationship between human settlement and insect life that the pre-war world would have recognized as deeply ordinary. The bloatfly represents a more alarming direction in post-war insect mutation, not because of its individual threat level, which is modest, but because of the specific modification that radiation produced in its biology, which has no clear pre-war parallel and which represents one of the more genuinely novel evolutionary developments that the wasteland's accelerated selection has generated. The bottlefly, from which the bloatfly descended, was in its pre-war form a creature of unremarkable capability, a small flying insect whose biological significance lay primarily in its role as a decomposer and as an occasional agricultural pest. The post-war bloatfly retains the bottlefly's general body plan and its flight capability, enlarged and modified by 2 centuries of selection, but has developed, in addition to these inherited characteristics, a biological mechanism for projecting blood-engorged larvae at targets from a distance, functioning as a living ranged weapon in a way that nothing in the bottlefly's biology or evolutionary history could have predicted or prepared for. The larvae themselves, once delivered, present a secondary threat not in the dramatic sense of the immediate attack, but in the practical sense of the infection that follows their presence in or on a target who lacks the medical capability to address them promptly. A bloatfly encountered alone in open terrain is a minor concern for any prepared traveler. A group of bloatflies, which is how they are most commonly encountered, represents a persistent attrition threat whose cumulative effect over the course of a day's travel in heavily infested terrain is more significant than any individual encounter within it would suggest. The rad scorpion is the insect world creature that most clearly demonstrates how dramatically radiation can rewrite the physical scale of an organism while preserving the functional architecture that made the pre-war version ecologically effective. The bark scorpion, the small, highly venomous arachnid of the American Southwest from which the rad scorpion descends, was, in its pre-war form, one of the most medically significant venomous creatures in the region it inhabited, capable of causing severe symptoms and occasional fatality despite a body length that rarely exceeded 3 inches. The structural constraints of the exoskeleton that arthropods use as their supporting framework impose a ceiling on the body size that the architecture can sustain, a ceiling that the pre-war bark scorpion was nowhere near approaching, but that the physics of the situation established as a genuine limit for the lineage. The post-war rad scorpion has exceeded this limit through biological modifications to its respiratory and structural systems that the pre-war scorpion did not possess, and that radiation's accelerated selection produced across the intervening generations, enlarging the organism to a scale that the physical principles governing pre-war arthropods would have made impossible, while preserving the fundamental predatory architecture of the scorpion body plan that had made the bark scorpion effective in its own, much smaller form. The venom that the rad scorpion delivers through its enlarged and modified stinger is not simply the bark scorpion's neurotoxin at greater volume. It is a modified compound, refined by the same generational pressure that reshaped the animal's physical scale, whose potency and mechanism of action have been substantially altered from the pre-war baseline. A rad scorpion sting delivers a toxin capable of rapid incapacitation in unmodified human targets, not the slow-building, medically manageable envenomation that the pre-war bark scorpion typically produced, but something that acts with sufficient speed and severity that the window between a successful sting and the loss of the capacity for effective self-defense is measured in minutes rather than hours. The albino rad scorpions, documented in the capital wasteland, represented a mutation within the broader rad scorpion mutation, a subpopulation displaying distinct physical characteristics, including the coloration that named them, and an enhanced individual threat profile that experienced wasteland travelers in the region treated as categorically distinct from the standard population, in the way that one learns to distinguish between gradations of a familiar danger that have proven, in practice, not to be gradations at all, but something that requires different preparation and different response. The fire ants of the capital wasteland represent the most clearly documented case of human post-war scientific activity, producing ecological consequences that its author neither intended nor could control. And the story of their creation is worth understanding in some detail because it illuminates a pattern that the wasteland's natural history returns to repeatedly. The giant ants that had established themselves in the capital wasteland region were the product of standard post-war radiation-driven mutation, the common North American carpenter ant and related species, enlarged by the same selection pressures that had enlarged every other insect in the affected regions, forming colonial populations in underground tunnel systems whose excavation and territorial defense behavior was directly continuous with the behavior of their much smaller pre-war ancestors. They were dangerous, as the wasteland's giant insects tended to be, and their colonies were disruptive to the settlements that established themselves above their tunnel networks. But they were comprehensible in the framework that the wasteland's inhabitants had developed for understanding the insect threats of their environment. Dr. Lesko's intervention was intended to make them less so, a scientific program aimed at reducing the enlarged ants to a more manageable size through modification of their pheromone system and related biological mechanisms. What the intervention produced instead was a mutation in the ant population's biology that gave them the capability to generate and project flammable biological compounds, a functional incendiary attack capacity that transformed the already significant threat of a giant ant colony into something that required the complete revision of every tactical assessment that the settlements in the affected region had made. The fire ants that spread from their point of origin at Greenwich into the surrounding capital wasteland were not a natural development of the radiation-driven mutation that had produced the giant ant population they had emerged from. They were an artifact of scientific intervention, a product of the specific combination of a well-intentioned researcher's inadequate understanding of the system he was modifying and the biological flexibility of an organism that had been refined by 350 million years of evolutionary history into something capable of incorporating unexpected modifications into functional new capabilities. They were also, once established, effectively impossible to eliminate through any means available to the settlements that found themselves contending with them. The wasteland did not offer the institutional capacity for the coordinated large-scale response that the elimination of an established fire ant population would have required. The settlements adapted to the fire ants' presence instead, as they adapted to most things in the wasteland, by reorganizing their lives around a threat they could not remove. The cazadores of the Mojave wasteland were not the product of natural mutation at all, even of the accelerated and unpredictable variety that the wasteland's radiation routinely generated. They were engineered, created, deliberately, by researchers at the Big Mountain Research and Development Center, whose approach to biological creativity was defined by the complete absence of the ethical constraints that might otherwise have introduced appropriate caution into their work. The tarantula hawk wasp, from which the cazadores were developed, was already among the most physically capable and behaviorally aggressive insects in the pre-war American Southwest, a creature whose hunting behavior targeted tarantulas specifically, paralyzing them through a sting of extraordinary pain and using their immobilized bodies as living incubators for its larvae, operating with a predatory sophistication that the insects of the pre-war world only rarely achieved at this level of tactical specificity. The Big Mountain researchers took this organism and subjected it to a combination of genetic modification and FEV exposure that produced something qualitatively different from its already formidable source material: larger, faster, capable of sustained flight. that the tarantula hawk's original aerodynamics had not fully permitted, and equipped with a venom that acted with a rapidity and a severity that the original organism's already significant sting could not have produced. The cazador's venom acts with a speed that makes it among the most immediately dangerous toxins delivered by any organism in the wastelands encounter roster. The window between a successful sting and the loss of effective physical function is shorter than with the rad scorpion, and the neurological components of the venom's mechanism produce symptoms, disorientation, sensory disruption, impaired coordination that compromise the target's ability to respond to subsequent attacks from the swarm that cazadores invariably represent, because cazadores do not hunt alone. They travel in groups and they attack in groups, and the venom that incapacitates a target against the first few stings leaves that target progressively less capable of managing the stings that follow. Their release into the Mojave environment, whether the deliberate act of researchers who considered them ready for field testing, or the accidental consequence of the institutional collapse that the Great War produced even in facilities as isolated as Big Mountain, introduced into the Mojave Desert an apex insect predator for which the region's ecology had no adequate check, no natural predator capable of effectively managing cazador population density, no environmental constraints sufficient to limit their spread, nothing but the geographic boundaries of the desert itself and the behavioral territories they established within it. The region around Zion Canyon, where the cazador population had established itself with the density that the canyon's specific ecological conditions supported, represented one of the most tactically demanding environments for cazador management that the wasteland's documented travelers encountered. Joshua Graham's assessments of movement through the canyon factored cazador presence as a primary constraint on route selection, approach timing, and group composition requirements, and his assessments were not hyperbole. The canyon's geography concentrated the swarms in ways that the open Mojave Desert did not, channeling movement through corridors where the density of cazador presence made cautious navigation effectively impossible and rapid movement through the most heavily infested sections, the only viable alternative to engagement on terms that heavily favored the swarms. The Commonwealth's insect ecology developed along independently produced lines. The specific environmental conditions of the northeastern wasteland generating its own variants of the insect mutations that the Mojave and the capital had produced through different mechanisms. Stingwings mutated dragonflies, significantly enlarged, capable of sustained flight, and equipped with a venomous stinger whose action was faster than it would appear to a traveler encountering them for the first time, occupied in the Commonwealth a similar ecological niche to the cazador. In the Mojave, but represented a mutation that radiation had produced rather than one that engineering had created. The distinction mattering not for practical threat assessment, but for what it revealed about the range of outcomes that natural selection, acting under extreme pressure, could achieve. The dragonfly body plan, already aerodynamically sophisticated in its pre-war form, had been enlarged and modified by the Commonwealth's specific radiation environment into something that moved through the wetlands and open terrain of the region, with a speed and agility that made visual tracking before engagement difficult, and whose venom's neurological effects compounded the difficulty of managing subsequent encounters with the swarms that followed the initial contact. The blood bug, descended from the mosquito, represented the continuation into the post-war period of a predatory relationship between insect and mammal that was among the oldest and most consistently present in the natural history of the regions the mosquito had occupied. The post-war blood bug was not the mosquito's pre-war successor in any simple sense. It was larger, its proboscis modified to penetrate the layers of fabric and light protective material that served most Commonwealth inhabitants as everyday clothing, its behavior more aggressively predatory than the pre-war mosquito's opportunistic feeding pattern had been. But the fundamental ecological relationship it maintained was continuous with its ancestors, the extraction of blood from warm-blooded hosts as a nutritional resource, pursued with the efficiency that 2 centuries of selection had refined from the already considerable efficiency of the pre-war mosquito's feeding mechanism. The bloodbugs in large size made it a more immediately recognizable threat than its ancestor had been, and it lacked the pre-war mosquito's capacity to operate beneath the threshold of human awareness that had made the small insect so effective as a disease vector in the old world. But it compensated for this disadvantage through the more direct predatory aggression that its modified biology supported, and the wounds it produced through its reinforced proboscis were susceptible to the same infections that any wound in the wasteland's medical environment was susceptible to, making the bloodbug's threat profile extend beyond the immediate encounter into the subsequent hours and days of a journey that might not offer adequate opportunity for wound management. Together, these insects, the radroach in the basement, the bloatfly on the open road, the radscorpion in the canyon, the fire ant in the tunnel system beneath a settlement whose inhabitants do not yet know it is there, the cazador rising from the scrub in the terrible silence that precedes its swarm, the stingwing crossing the wetland at a speed that makes range estimation unreliable, the bloodbug descending from the high grass in the humid lowland air constitute not a collection of individual hazards, but an ecology. They interact with each other and with the larger organisms of the wasteland in ways that are organized by the same principles of predation and competition and ecological role that organized the pre-war insect world, simply operating at scales and with capabilities that the pre-war world did not contain. The Deathclaw that takes a radscorpion when the opportunity presents is participating in the same food web that the radscorpion participates in when it takes the mole rat, and that the mole rat participates in when it processes the roots of the mutfruit plant, and that the mutfruit plant participates in when its roots draw nutrients from soil that the radroach's decomposition activity has made available. The wasteland's insect world is not a disruption of the ecology that the bombs destroyed. It is the foundation of the ecology that the bombs produced, and it will be the foundation of whatever ecology follows the one that exists now, as it was the foundation of whatever came before the bombs in the first place. Because the insects of North America have outlasted every catastrophe that the continent's history has generated, and there is no particular reason to believe that the Great War, for all its comprehensiveness, will prove to be the exception to that record. Section 7. The contaminated waters, mirelurks, lake lurks, and the aquatic horrors of every region. The waterways of the post-war world accumulated radiation in quantities that no other environment in the affected landscape could match, because water does what water has always done. It moves across the surface of the land and collects what it finds there, gathering the fallout that the bombs deposited on soil and stone and the ruins of everything human civilization had built, drawing it downward through the substrate and concentrating it in the rivers and lakes and estuaries and coastal shallows that represented the natural terminus of every drainage system across the continent. The rivers of the eastern seaboard ran through the most heavily bombed corridor in North America, collecting the fallout of multiple direct strikes on multiple major cities and carrying it steadily toward the sea, enriching the water column with radioactive particles at every stage of that journey. The Chesapeake Bay, which had been one of the most productive estuarine environments in the pre-war world, a body of water whose ecological complexity and biological diversity had made it a subject of scientific study and conservation effort for 4 generations, received the concentrated runoff of this entire watershed and held it, in its shallow and semi-enclosed basin, in a degree of sustained contact with the organisms that lived within it that no other aquatic environment in the region could duplicate. 2 centuries of this exposure produced, in the crustaceans and reptiles and other invertebrates that inhabited that basin and the waterways that fed it, a range of biological transformations as comprehensive and as ecologically significant as anything that the terrestrial environment of the wasteland generated. The creatures that emerged from the Chesapeake's contaminated waters were not simply larger versions of their pre-war ancestors. They were novel organisms shaped by 2 centuries of exceptional selection pressure into something whose relationship to those ancestors was ancestral rather than continuous, traceable but transformed, rooted in a biological history that the transformation had not erased but had thoroughly rewritten. The name Mirrorlurk encompasses a family of related but biologically distinct organisms that share their common ancestry with pre-war crustaceans and other estuarine invertebrates, but that have diverged from those ancestors across 2 centuries of radiation-driven change in ways that make the common name more a reflection of behavioral and ecological similarity than of biological unity. They lurk in the mire. They emerge from it with a territorial aggression and a physical capability that makes them among the most consistently dangerous water-associated hazards in every region they inhabit. Beyond these shared characteristics, the individual members of the Mirrorlurk family represent meaningfully different organisms that demand different tactical responses and carry different ecological roles in the environments they organize around themselves. The standard Mirrorlurk, the crab-derived variant, thought to originate most directly from the horseshoe crabs of the pre-war Chesapeake Bay region, whose ancient and biologically conservative body plan proved exceptionally receptive to radiation-driven modification, is distinguished above all other characteristics by the carapace that covers its frontal surfaces. This is not the thin, flexible exoskeleton of its pre-war crab ancestors, a structure that served primarily as a framework for the attachment of muscles and a modest barrier against the minor physical threats of the estuarine environment. It is something that post-war biology built across generations of selection, a structure whose thickness and composition and layered organization resist penetration in ways that approach the performance of engineered armor while remaining entirely biological in its production and maintenance. Conventional small arms fire against the frontal surface of a Mirrorlurk carapace transfers its energy into the structure without the penetration necessary to reach the organism beneath, and the Mirrorlurk continues its approach as if the impact had not occurred, because from the perspective of its biology, it has not occurred in any meaningful sense. There has been noise and vibration and a momentary force against the surface that its carapace was built to absorb, and nothing else. The face, when the Mirrorlurk briefly elevates its head above the carapace's protective overhang in the course of its movement and attack behavior, presents the primary vulnerability, a region of exposed tissue through which the neural structures responsible for the organism's sensory and motor function can be reached, and whose exposure is brief, unpredictable, and requires both patience and precision from the traveler who intends to exploit it. The Mirrorlurk hunter, derived from the lobster lineage rather than the crab lineage, and representing an independently evolved branch of the Mirrorlurk family rather than a developmental stage within it, occupies a substantially more aggressive behavioral niche than the standard Mirrorlurk, and brings to its interactions with other organisms a predatory architecture that the lobster's pre-war body plan had already partially prepared. It stands upright rather than moving on the low-slung horizontal plane of the standard Mirrorlurk, and this posture gives it a reach and a tactical flexibility that the standard Mirrorlurk's body plan does not provide. Its most significant modification, beyond its physical construction, is the capability it has developed for projecting stomach acid at range, a biological ranged attack, whose existence in a crustacean has no pre-war parallel, and that represents one of the more striking examples of how radiation-accelerated selection, operating without direction or intention, can produce functional capabilities that the standard mechanisms of evolutionary biology would have required vastly longer timescales to develop. The acid that the Mirrorlurk hunter projects is corrosive to most materials that the wasteland traveler uses for clothing and light armor, and its effect on exposed skin and mucous membranes is immediate and severe, creating wounds that require prompt treatment, and that in the absence of such treatment, progress toward infections that the wasteland's standard medical resources struggle to address. The Mirelurk king presents the most distinctive departure from the crustacean ancestry that defines the broader Mirelurk family, because the Mirelurk king is not crustacean in its origins at all. The biological analysis available to the wastelands scientific community suggests that Mirelurk kings derive from the snapping turtle, a reptile rather than a crustacean, representing a convergent evolutionary trajectory that arrived at the Mirelurk ecological role through a completely different ancestral path. The snapping turtle of the pre-war Chesapeake watershed had been exposed to the same contamination that had transformed the bay's crustacean population, and the transformation it underwent carried it toward a body plan and a behavioral role that brought it into the same ecological space as its crab-derived counterparts, without biological relationship to them. The Mirelurk king is bipedal and significantly taller than the standard Mirelurk, capable of movement across terrain that the low-slung crab variants cannot navigate with the same efficiency, and possessed of a sonic attack capability that represents a weapon of a different category from anything the physical architecture of the crustacean Mirelurks can produce. The sonic emission that the Mirelurk king generates disrupts the neural function of unshielded listeners at ranges that make close-quarters evasion essentially impossible, not merely painful. As the wasteland's many sources of physical harm are painful, but cognitively disruptive in a way that impairs the target's ability to make the decisions that managing the subsequent stages of the encounter requires. In terrain that amplifies and focuses acoustic energy, the enclosed spaces of coastal ruins, the narrow approaches of river gorges, the low ceilings of underground drainage systems, the sonic attack's effective range extends well beyond what open terrain encounters might suggest, and the experienced traveler who hears the distinctive vocalization that precedes it in an enclosed space is receiving information whose tactical implication is not subtle. The Mirelurk queen is an entity of a different order from any other member of the family, encountered rarely, but representing, in those rare encounters, a threat whose scale makes the rarity feel insufficient as a reassurance. A Mirelurk queen is the largest organism the Mirelurk lineage produces, and it is large in a way that the simple multiplication of the standard Mirelurk's dimensions does not adequately convey large in the way that changes the character of the space it occupies. That makes the terrain features a human traveler uses for cover and concealment functionally irrelevant, because the creature moving through that terrain does not recognize those features as obstacles in any practical sense. Its acid projection capability operates at a range and a volume that exceeds anything the Mirelurk hunter produces, delivered not in the precise targeted stream of the hunter's attack, but in quantities that create an area of effect rather than a point of impact, a tactical difference that makes the evasive responses available against the hunter's attack inadequate against the queen's. The queen's physical resilience is proportional to her physical scale, and the sustained firepower required to reduce it to a level at which her biological systems cease to function effectively represents a logistical demand that the available resources of most wasteland travelers, assembled under the conditions that the wasteland makes available, can struggle to meet before the encounter's terms have shifted decisively in the queen's favor. The lake lurks of the Mojave represent the convergent development of the Mirelurk ecological role in a freshwater environment, whose characteristics differed substantially from the estuarine conditions of the Chesapeake watershed, and they demonstrate that the biological pressures the Chesapeake's contamination had applied to its crustacean and reptile populations were not specific to that environment, but represented a more general response to the combination of radiation exposure and aquatic habitat that any sufficiently contaminated body of water could produce. The lake lurks of Lake Mead, where the Hoover Dam's continued function had maintained water levels that supported a substantial aquatic ecosystem, despite everything the surrounding desert and the post-war contamination had done to the watershed's chemistry derived from the turtle lineage as the Mirelurk king did. representing an independently arrived at version of the same evolutionary transformation that the Chesapeake's snapping turtle population had undergone on the other side of the continent. Their sonic attack was functionally analogous to the Mirelurk King's in its mechanism and its neural effects, but tuned to the acoustic characteristics of the canyon-confined freshwater environment. It had evolved within an environment where the sandstone walls that formed Lake Mead's shoreline channeled and reflected sound energy in ways that amplified the attack's effective range and made the enclosed approach corridors through which access to the lake required passage particularly hazardous for travelers who had not developed specific countermeasures for lake lurk encounters in those specific geographic conditions. The swamps of Point Lookout, in the tidal marshes of the mid-Atlantic coastline, supported a Mirelurk population whose development reflected the specific character of that environment. The organic richness of the tidal wetland, the particular chemical composition of water that mixed salt and fresh water in the ratios that the tidal cycle produced, the specific radiation profile of a region that had received both direct fallout from the capital's multiple strikes and the accumulated runoff of the Potomac watershed across 2 centuries. The swamp lurk variants documented in Point Lookout were heavier and more massively constructed than their Chesapeake counterparts, adapted to movement through the dense, organic substrate of the swamp environment in ways that the more open water variants were not, and possessed of a physical resilience that the specific conditions of their environment, which placed a premium on the ability to sustain damage from the multiple competing predatory organisms that the swamp's ecological complexity contained, had refined over generations to a level that distinguished them from the standard Mirelurk threat profile in ways that travelers unfamiliar with the region consistently failed to anticipate adequately. The island of Far Harbor existed within an environmental context whose combination of historical, industrial contamination, post-war fallout, and the specific radiation characteristics of the northeastern Atlantic coastline had produced aquatic creatures found nowhere else in the documented wasteland, representing evolutionary trajectories that the specific conditions of the island's freshwater and coastal systems had generated independently of anything the broader wasteland ecology had produced. The anglers of the island's lake and river systems presented perhaps the most immediately counterintuitive of these creatures, descended from the deep-sea anglerfish, whose pre-war habitat was the lightless depths of the open ocean, yet somehow established in the shallow freshwater environments of an island whose access to those oceanic depths was indirect at most. The mechanism of their introduction to the island's freshwater systems was not documented in any record available to those who eventually explored the region, and the biological pathway by which a deep-sea organism established itself in a freshwater island environment represented one of the more genuinely puzzling ecological mysteries that the island presented to anyone who took the time to consider it. What the angler did with the freshwater environment it had colonized was what the pre-war anglerfish had done with the lightless deep. It adapted its fundamental predatory mechanism to the conditions available to it, developing a bioluminescent lure that functioned not in the absence of all light, as the oceanic originals did, but within the perpetual fog that characterized much of the island's landscape, creating a point of light in the grey-white murk that the island's atmospheric conditions produced and that drew attention toward it in the way that anything bright in a landscape of undifferentiated grey drew attention. The angler waited in concealment beneath the surface of the water, in the dense vegetation of the wetland margins, in any position that allowed it to present the lure while keeping the body that produced it effectively hidden, and allowed the lure to do the work of bringing prey into the range that the ambush required. The bioluminescence that served its hunting mechanism also made it detectable in conditions that made most other things invisible, a paradox that the organism had presumably not evolved any capacity to appreciate, and that the experienced island traveler learned to treat as a warning rather than a point of orientation. The gulpers of Far Harbor's wetland regions presented a different category of aquatic threat, not the patient ambush predator of the angler's model, but something more actively predatory, descended from the salamander lineage, and retaining enough of the salamander's general body plan to be recognizable as related to its pre-war ancestors, while representing in its actual physical scale and predatory capability something qualitatively different from anything the pre-war salamander family had produced. A gulper's predatory mechanism was its most immediately defining characteristic, the ability to swallow prey whole, enabled by a jaw structure and a digestive system modified by generations of selection toward the processing of prey items at the upper end of the size range that the island's wetlands contained. The name the island's human population had given it was not metaphorical. It gulped. It did so with the speed and the finality that made the encounter with one in the dense vegetation of the island's inland wetlands, a situation whose outcome was determined largely by how much warning the traveler had received before. The gulper's proximity made warning irrelevant. The fog crawlers of Far Harbor occupied the position in the island's ecology that the Deathclaw occupied in the continental wastelands, the apex predator whose individual capability set the practical ceiling on what unprotected or inadequately prepared human travelers could safely navigate, and whose territorial presence organized the movement patterns of every other organism in the environments it inhabited around the imperative of managing the encounter it represented. The fog crawlers were hypothesized to derive from shrimp or a closely related small marine crustacean organisms whose pre-war scale was measured in centimeters and whose pre-war ecological role was the kind of minor and distributed contribution to marine food webs that made them significant in aggregate and invisible individually. What the island's specific environmental conditions had done to this lineage across 2 centuries of exposure produced something that bore the same ancestral relationship to the shrimp that the miralurk bore to the horseshoe crab, traceable through biological analysis, incomprehensible through simple observation. A fog crawler was enormous, built along a crustacean body plan that had been scaled upward to a degree that transformed every physical relationship it had with its environment, the ground it moved across, the vegetation it moved through, the structures it encountered in the ruins of the island's human settlements, from a context that constrained it to a backdrop against which it moved without reference to constraint. The fog of the island was not incidental to the fog crawler's biology but integrated into it, the creature's sensory systems having developed in relation to conditions of perpetual low visibility in ways that made it more capable in the fog than out of it, more precisely oriented, more effectively predatory, more completely in possession of the informational advantage that every successful predator seeks in relation to its prey. Its coloration provided effective camouflage in the grey-white environment that the island's coastlines presented under fog conditions, and its movement was calibrated to the acoustic and olfactory landscape that the fog created, rather than to the visual landscape that the fog concealed. The traveler, approaching an area of heavy fog on the island's coastline, with the assumption that the reduced visibility was a constraint that applied equally to everything moving within it, was making an assessment that the fog crawlers of that coastline would, given adequate proximity and patience, demonstrate to be incorrect. Section 8. The changed mammals. Yaoguai, mole rats, Brahmin, and the familiar made strange. The mutation of mammals carries with it a particular quality of recognition that the mutation of insects or crustaceans does not produce. And the reason for this is not difficult to locate if one is willing to examine it honestly. The pre-war human relationship with the large mammals of North America was not the relationship between a person and an ecological abstraction. It was the relationship between organisms that shared a significant portion of their evolutionary history that possessed, in varying degrees, the same basic cognitive architecture, the same neurological foundations for the processing of experience and the navigation of social relationships, and the same fundamental biological responses to the conditions of the world they inhabited. The bear that a pre-war hiker encountered in a national forest was not a creature whose experience of that encounter could be assumed to resemble the hikers in any detailed way, but it was a creature whose fear response and threat assessment behavior and territorial logic were, at some level, recognizable, comprehensible, not as human thought, but as something that shared enough of human thought's foundations to permit a degree of cross-species reading. The post-war yaoguai that a wasteland traveler encounters in the forested margins of the glowing sea has none of this comprehensibility available to it. It is larger than the black bear it descended from by a margin that changes the physical character of every interaction. It is more aggressive by a degree that removes the behavioral flexibility that made the pre-war black bear's encounters with humans occasional tragedies rather than routine inevitabilities. And it looks enough like what it used to be that the traveler who encounters it for the first time may spend a dangerous fraction of a second reaching for a framework of understanding that the wasteland has not preserved. The black bear, from which the yaoguai descended, was one of the most widely distributed large mammals in pre-war North America, present in forested and mountainous terrain across the continent, adaptable in its diet and its habitat requirements, possessed of an intelligence that the pre-war scientific community considered among the highest of any non-primate North American mammal, and characterized by a wariness of human beings that reflected the long history of a species that had learned, across generations of contact with a technologically superior predator, that discretion was a more reliable survival strategy than aggression. This wariness was not eliminated by the Great War, so much as overwritten the radiation that reshaped the bear's physiology toward the yaoguai's larger and more aggressive form, also reshaped the neurological architecture that had produced the pre-war bear's caution, replacing it with the territorial absolutism that the post-war environment, which had removed the specific pressures that had selected for caution in the first place, reinforced across generations of selection. The yaoguai that emerges from the tree line toward a wasteland traveler is not being reckless. It is being what its environment shaped it to be, which is an organism whose assessment of every encounter involving another large organism begins from the premise that territorial engagement is the appropriate response. The yaoguai's physical modification from its black bear ancestor is significant in scale, but conservative in architecture. The fundamental body plan of the bear persists, enlarged and reinforced rather than restructured, so that the capabilities that made the pre-war black bear a significant predatory and defensive force have simply been amplified to the degree that the larger platform makes possible. The bite force that a mature yaoguai can apply exceeds anything the pre-war bear could have produced, delivered through a jaw structure that has been reinforced by the same generational pressure that reinforced every other load-bearing element of the body. The forelimbs that a pre-war black bear used to manipulate food sources and establish dominance through physical contact are, in the yaoguai, instruments of a striking force that can collapse the structural integrity of reinforced wooden construction in a single blow, and that engages the outer surfaces of light metal armor with an effect that most wearers of such armor had not anticipated when they assessed its protective value. The yaoguai does not possess the intelligence that would allow it to develop tactical approaches to armored opponents. It simply hits harder than the armor was designed to absorb, and the design assumption it exceeds is one that the armor's pre-war designers would have considered adequate for the threats their product was intended to address. The mole rat represents the most ecologically consequential of the wasteland's mutated small mammals, not because of the individual threat that any mole rat presents, which is modest in the framework of what the wasteland's encounter roster contains, but because of the collective impact that mole rat colonial behavior, applied at the scale that the post-war environment supports, produces on the physical landscape that human settlements depend upon. The naked mole rat, from which the wasteland's mole rat descended, was already among the most biologically unusual mammals in the pre-war world, a creature whose colonial social organization resembled the eusocial structure of ants and bees, more than anything in the standard mammalian behavioral repertoire, whose tolerance for low oxygen environments reflected metabolic adaptations without parallel in other mammals, and whose resistance to certain forms of cellular damage that radiation typically produced was a consequence of the unusual biology that its subterranean lifestyle had developed over millions of years of selection. These pre-war characteristics were not eliminated by the radiation-driven transformation that produced the wasteland mole rat. They were preserved and in some cases amplified, carried forward into an organism of greater physical size and substantially increased territorial aggression, operating in the post-war landscape's subsurface in the same colonial patterns that its ancestors had used, but at a scale that the larger bodies and the larger territories of the post-war form required. The tunnel systems that mole rat colonies excavate beneath the wasteland surface are not simply the incidental product of the animal's movement through the substrate. They are structured, maintained, and deliberately extended over time in ways that reflect the same colonial intelligence that organized the pre-war naked mole rat subterranean community, applied to the practical engineering problems of creating a network adequate to the colony's territorial and resource requirements. These networks can extend across distances that the surface landscape above them gives no indication of, creating subsurface voids that undermine the structural integrity of whatever has been built on the surface above them, not through deliberate destructive intent, but through the simple mechanical consequence of removing material from beneath load-bearing soil. The settlements built without adequate knowledge of underlying mole rat activity occasionally discovered this consequence in ways that were both expensive and, in the worst cases, dangerous. A foundation that has been progressively hollowed from beneath, expressing its compromised condition, not gradually, but suddenly. When the remaining substrate reaches the threshold below, which it can no longer sustain the load it has been carrying, the mole rat colony that produced this outcome was not attempting to destroy the settlement above it. It was doing what mole rat colonies do in the space available to them, without any awareness that the space above the space it occupied was organized in ways that its activity was disrupting. The mole rat disease documented among the Commonwealth's mole rat population introduced a biological dimension to mole rat encounters that transformed the risk calculus of those encounters in ways that the immediate physical threat of the animals did not by itself suggest. A scratch from an infected mole rat delivered a pathogen whose effect on the human biology it entered was not the rapid and obvious deterioration of the most immediately dangerous wasteland infections, but a slower and subtler alteration. A progressive modification of the infected person's biology that, without specific pharmaceutical intervention, moved toward outcomes whose character reflected the nature of the pathogen's origins in a profoundly transformed organism. The treatment required for mole rat disease was available within the Commonwealth's medical resources, but not universally distributed, and the traveller who encountered mole rats in a region distant from those resources and who sustained an infection in the course of that encounter was in a situation whose management required both the knowledge of what had occurred and the practical capability to address it before the alteration progressed to a stage that the available interventions could no longer adequately reverse. The tunnelers of the divide represented the mole rat lineage's most extreme expression of what radiation and environmental pressure could produce when both operated at the intensity that the divide's specific conditions generated. The divide was, by the time the courier moved through it, among the most environmentally hostile regions in the documented wasteland, a landscape whose history of nuclear detonation and subsequent atmospheric and geological disruption had produced conditions that no organism, not specifically adapted to them, could sustain for any meaningful period. The tunnelers were adapted to them. They had been shaped by the divide's extreme environment into something that used the fractured terrain and unstable substrate of the landscape as the medium through which they conducted their predatory behavior, moving through it with a speed that belied the difficulty of the substrate and emerging from it with the sudden and disorienting efficiency of a predator whose approach is literally subterranean until the moment of the attack. Ulysses, who had spent more time in the Divide than any other documented human traveler, did not describe the tunnelers as a hazard among hazards. He described them as the dominant life form of the region, the organisms around whose presence and territorial behavior every other aspect of navigating the Divide had to be organized. The way that Deathclaw territory organized movement in the regions where Deathclaws had established themselves as the uncontested apex presence. Brahmin occupy a category entirely their own within the wasteland's transformed mammal population, because their transformation was not merely biological but economic, a modification of the cattle lineage that produced an organism whose post-war utility was at least as significant as its pre-war ancestors, and that became, as a consequence, the foundation upon which the wasteland's emerging economic systems were built as thoroughly as cattle had been the foundation of the pre-war agricultural economy. The domestic cattle of North America were present in enormous numbers on October 23rd, distributed across the continent's agricultural landscape in a density that reflected the central role they played in the food systems of the pre-war world. And the ones that survived the bombing's immediate effects were exposed to the same radiation that had transformed every other organism in the affected regions. Their transformation produced the two-headed bovine that every wasteland settlement knew as Brahmin, an organism that retained the cattle's fundamental agricultural utility while developing the biological characteristics that made it viable in conditions that pre-war cattle could not have sustained. The two-headed characteristic that is the most immediately visible feature of the Brahmin mutation is not the most significant. More important, for the communities that depend on Brahmin for their survival, is the resistance to environmental radiation that the transformation produced, the capacity to process contaminated forage and produce from it the milk and meat that constitute a reliable nutritional base for human populations that have no alternative source of animal protein available at comparable scale. A pre-war dairy cow introduced to the wasteland's contaminated pastures would sicken and die, its biological systems unable to manage the radioactive load that the contaminated plants it ate would deliver. The Brahmin grazes those same pastures and produces milk from them that is nutritious in ways that sustain the humans who drink it. Its transformed biology, having developed the capacity to process what the pre-war animal could not, and to filter or metabolize the contamination that would otherwise make the nutritional resource the contaminated landscape offers inaccessible. This is not a small thing. It is, in the accounting of the wasteland's survival economics, among the most consequential biological transformations that the post-war period produced, because it determined whether the human communities that survived the bombing could sustain themselves nutritionally across the long term, or would face a ceiling on their population and their development imposed by the inadequacy of the protein sources available to them. The Brahmin caravan was not a consequence of Brahmin domestication. It was the mechanism through which Brahmin domestication produced civilization. The animal's tractability and load-bearing capability, combined with its radiation resistance and its ability to subsist on contaminated forage, made it the ideal transport animal for a world in which the roads were irradiated and the journey between settlements required passage through environments that human travelers without Brahmin support could not sustain across the distances that meaningful trade required. The caravan operators who first organized regular routes between the early settlements of California were Brahmin herders before they were merchants, and the trade networks that eventually connected enough settlements to constitute the beginning of the new California Republic's economic foundation were Brahmin-dependent at every stage of their development. Without Brahmin, there were no caravans. Without caravans, there were no trade networks. Without trade networks, the isolated settlements of the post-war world remained isolated, and the particular form of slow civilizational recovery that the wasteland's human populations achieved across 2 centuries of effort was either dramatically slower or did not occur at all. The Brahmin's transformation was, in this accounting, one of the most consequential ecological events of the post-war period, not because of what the transformation did to the cattle, but because of what it made possible for the humans who organized their economic lives around the transformed animals' capabilities. Wild Brahmin populations descended from domestic animals that escaped management in the chaos of the early post-war period and established themselves as free-ranging herds in the regions that offered adequate forage, were present across every major wasteland area, and represented a resource that the settlements adjacent to their ranges tried to manage, with varying degrees of success, as a supplement to their domestic herds. The wild Brahmin's behavior was not dramatically different from that of domestic Brahmin. The transformation that produced the species had not introduced the kind of heightened aggression that the Yao Guai and the mole rat exhibited relative to their domestic or socially managed pre-war counterparts, but it was sufficiently independent and sufficiently organized around the herd's own territorial and resource logic that managing wild populations required specific knowledge and skill that not every settlement had available to it. The feral dogs and mongrels of the wasteland closed the loop on the mammalian transformation that the Great War had initiated by representing the animal that had been most intimately associated with human civilization across the longest period of that civilization's history. The domestic dog had been shaped by 10,000 years of selective breeding in relationship with human beings, and that shaping had produced an organism whose social and communicative orientation toward humans was unique in the animal world, not simply a tamed wild animal, but something that had been genuinely transformed by its relationship with humanity into a creature that understood and responded to human social signals with a facility that no other domesticated species could match. The bombs had not eliminated this relationship. They had simply removed the specific human infrastructure that had maintained it, the households and the yards and the food supplies and the veterinary care that the pre-war dog's life had been organized around, leaving feral populations to manage without those supports in a world that was dramatically more hostile than anything the domestic dog's recent evolutionary history had prepared it for. The feral mongrels of the wasteland were not the pre-war domestic dog with its social orientation toward humans removed. They were a population whose social orientation remained present as an inherited characteristic, and whose practical expression of that orientation had been rewritten by generations of experience in an environment where the specific humans they encountered were as likely to be threats as allies. The wasteland mongrel that approached a settlement's perimeter was not approaching it in the way that a pre-war feral dog might have approached a human habitation, with the residual domesticity of an animal whose recent ancestral experience of humans was predominantly positive. It was approaching it in the way of an animal whose relationship to human settlements was complex, whose assessment of any specific encounter incorporated the accumulated experience of a lineage that had learned, across generations, that the outcome of such encounters was not predictable in advance and required careful evaluation of the specific situation before committing to any particular behavioral response. The settlements that managed successful relationships with wasteland dog populations did so through the deliberate cultivation of those relationships over time, through the consistent provision of food and safety in exchange for the companionship and early warning capability that a dog's sensory systems, even in a significantly mutated form, continued to provide with a reliability that no mechanical substitute available to the wasteland's communities could match. Section 9. Regional Nightmares. The Mojave's engineered horrors and Far Harbor's fog creatures. The wasteland's ecology is not uniform across the regions it encompasses, and the reason for this is not merely the variation in pre-war species distributions or the differences in how specific geographic environments interacted with the radiation that the Great War deposited across the continent. It is also the variation in what human scientific activity had been doing in specific locations before the bombs fell, the particular research directions being pursued in particular facilities, the specific organisms being modified in specific programs, the range of biological creativity that different institutional cultures and different resource levels and different degrees of ethical constraint had permitted and pursued in the years and decades before October 23rd rendered. All of it simultaneously moot and permanent. The creatures that emerged from radiation alone represent one category of the wasteland's biological landscape. The creatures that emerged from deliberate pre-war engineering, released into that landscape by the collapse of the institutions that had created and nominally contained them, represent something that overlaps with the first category in its ecological consequences, but differs from it fundamentally in its origins. Not the patient work of selection acting on random variation, but the purposeful application of intelligence toward specific biological outcomes, producing organisms whose characteristics reflect not the logic of survival in a particular environment, but the logic of research programs that were pursuing particular goals with the tools they had available and without adequate consideration of what would happen if those tools were no longer in anyone's hands. The Big Mountain Research and Development Center, situated in the remote terrain of what had been the American Southwest and accessible in the post-war period through a mechanism that would not have been comprehensible within any pre-war scientific framework, represents the most extreme concentration of pre-war scientific ambition without ethical constraint that the wasteland's documented history contains. The researchers who worked there had access to technologies and methodologies that exceeded what any other pre-war institution could claim, including the full range of genetic modification techniques that the most advanced civilian and military biology programs of the era had developed, the forced evolutionary virus in multiple strains and at multiple stages of modification, and the computational resources to design biological systems of a complexity that surpassed what any single researcher or research team working with conventional tools could have managed. They also operated, by every indication available in the records they left behind, in an environment whose relationship to the ethical frameworks that governed scientific practice in the broader pre-war world was essentially theoretical. They knew what those frameworks said. They had, in most cases, been trained in institutions that taught them. They had simply concluded, through whatever combination of institutional culture and personal rationalization and genuine intellectual conviction that the particular environment of Big Mountain cultivated, that the importance of what they were learning justified whatever was required to learn it. The Night Stalker is the organism that most completely illustrates Big Mountain's particular approach to biological creativity, because it represents something that the standard model of mutation-driven transformation cannot produce, and that required the specific combination of deliberate genetic engineering and FEV application that only an institution of Big Mountain's capabilities could have attempted. The rattlesnake and the coyote are organisms that share the North American Southwest as their habitat, but that occupy different kingdoms of the biological classification system, reptile and mammal, separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary divergence, possessed of entirely different cellular architectures, reproductive strategies, physiological systems, and neurological organizations. They do not hybridize. The mechanisms through which sexual reproduction transfers genetic material between organisms are not compatible across the distance that separates the reptile and mammal lineages, and the natural world contains nothing in its standard toolkit that can bridge that distance in a living organism. Big Mountain's researchers bridged it anyway, using FEV's capacity for radical genetic rewriting as the mechanism through which the incompatibility of two fundamentally different biological architectures was resolved into a single organism that functioned, reproduced, and organized its behavior according to principles drawn from both of its ancestral lines simultaneously. The Night Stalker that resulted from this process carries its dual heritage in every observable aspect of its biology. The body is mammalian, the four-limbed, fur-bearing, warm-blooded form of the coyote, modified in size and proportion, but recognizable in its fundamental architecture as a product of the mammalian evolutionary tradition. The tail is reptilian, a rattlesnake's tail, functional in its rattle mechanism and its venom delivery system, connected to the mammalian body by the biological interfaces that Big Mountain's engineering created and maintained through the organism's cellular processes in ways that neither parent lineage's biology would have supported independently. The behavior draws on both ancestral repertoires simultaneously. The coyote's pack-hunting intelligence and social coordination, combined with neurological characteristics from the rattlesnake lineage that produce responses to threat and opportunity distinct from anything a pure coyote behavioral system would generate. Night Stalkers hunt cooperatively, using the coordinated pursuit strategies and the communicative social organization of the canid predator they partly are, but they hunt with a patience and a stillness between active pursuit phases that reflects the reptilian heritage, and they deliver their venom with the precision of an organism whose venom delivery system was refined over millions of years of rattlesnake evolution before Big Mountain's engineers incorporated it into something that had never existed before. Their reproductive success in the Mojave environment demonstrated that the biological compatibility Big Mountain had engineered into the Night Stalker was not merely functional in the laboratory, but genuinely self-sustaining in the fiendsys field, that the organism could reproduce, and that its offspring inherited the combined characteristics of both ancestral lines in the stable configuration that the initial engineering had established, rather than fragmenting back toward one parent lineage or the other across generations. This stability was not guaranteed by the theory that had guided the organism's creation, and the fact of its achievement represented either a genuine triumph of pre-war genetic engineering or a demonstration of the robustness of FEV's rewriting capability in ways that exceeded what the program's designers had been certain of when they committed to the approach. The Night Stalker pack, encountered in the Mojave's arroyos and rocky terrain, was not a biological artifact of a pre-war experiment in the way that a laboratory specimen is an artifact. It was a self-sustaining population, living in a landscape it had been shaped to inhabit, organized according to behavioral principles that the engineering had created, and that the subsequent generations of natural selection had refined toward the specific demands of the Mojave environment. It was, in its own terms, wild as anything in the wasteland that had arrived at its present form through less intentional means. The geckos of the western wasteland, which required no engineering to produce, because radiation alone had been sufficient to transform the small lizards of the pre-war Southwest into organisms of significantly greater physical scale and ecological significance, illustrated the range of outcomes that natural mutation could achieve when operating on a reptile lineage in the Mojave's specific radiation environment. The fire gecko presented the most immediately dramatic modification from the gecko's pre-war baseline: the development of a biological mechanism for generating and projecting flammable compounds that the gecko's modified physiology produced through processes that the wasteland's scientific resources had not fully characterized. Whether the mechanism derived from modifications to the digestive chemistry, the respiratory system, or some other biological pathway was a question that remained open, because the practical demands of managing fire gecko encounters in the regions where they were common had historically taken priority over the scientific interest of answering it. What was not in question was the functional reality of the capability or its tactical implications, which were clear to anyone who had encountered a fire gecko in the enclosed spaces, the cave systems, and mine shafts, and collapsed structures where they preferentially established their territories, and where the flammable, compounds they projected in those enclosed spaces had nowhere to dissipate before the ignition that followed. The golden gecko represented a different evolutionary direction, its distinctive coloration accompanying a radiation resistance that exceeded the standard gecko's already significant tolerance, and that made the most contaminated regions of the Mojave accessible to it in ways that most other organisms, including the standard gecko, found prohibitive. The golden gecko in a heavily irradiated area was not merely surviving conditions that other organisms could not sustain, it was thriving in them, its biology having been shaped by the specific selection pressure of extreme radiation into something that used what should have been a hostile environment as a competitive advantage, occupying ecological niches that the radiation levels effectively reserved for organisms with its specific capabilities. The green gecko, the most widely distributed and most frequently encountered of the variants, represented the baseline expression of what radiation had done to the gecko lineage, without the additional modifications that the fire and golden variants carried. Larger, more aggressive, and more physically capable than its pre-war ancestor, but comprehensible within the framework that the wastelands travelers developed for understanding the gecko as a category of threat, rather than presenting the additional complicating characteristics that the specialized variants introduced. The bighorner, descended from the bighorn sheep of the pre-war American West, occupied the space in the Mojave's ecological landscape that the Brahmin occupied in the eastern wastelands. The large, relatively tractable herbivore, whose transformed biology made it viable in the contaminated environment, and whose management by human communities provided a nutritional and economic resource that supported settlement at scales that would otherwise have been difficult to sustain. The bighorner was not domesticated in the comprehensive sense that Brahmin had been domesticated across the wasteland's broader economy, but the communities of the Mojave that had developed the knowledge and the established relationships necessary for managing small bighorner herds had found in those herds a supplement to the more widely available Brahmin-based economy that the region's specific geography and resource distribution made practically valuable. Young bighorners, in particular, proved amenable to the kind of sustained human contact that gradual domestication required, and the Mojave's scattered settlements that had invested the time and the consistency that managing a small bighorner population demanded had generally found the investment worthwhile in the nutritional terms that the wasteland's survival economics made the relevant measure of any such decision. The marked men of the divide occupied a category that resisted simple placement within any of the biological frameworks that the wasteland's other transformed beings occupied, because what the divide had done to them was not mutation in any conventional sense, and not FEV transformation, and not ghoulification, but something that had no name in the wasteland's vocabulary for transformation, because nothing else in the wasteland's history had produced it through the same mechanism. They were human beings who had survived something that should have killed them, and had emerged from that survival in a state that represented the body's most desperate and most costly possible response to conditions of absolute extremity, the catastrophic damage of nuclear detonation, absorbed by organisms whose biology refused to cease functioning, maintained at the threshold of continued life through processes that the normal regulatory systems governing biological integrity had abandoned entirely in favor of simple persistence. Their skin had been stripped by the blast effects and had not recovered in any meaningful sense. The regenerative systems that would normally address such damage had been overwhelmed, and in many cases simply were not present in the way that 2 centuries of radiation had modified the biology of every organism in the wasteland, and what remained was exposure so comprehensive and so permanent that the nervous systems processing it had reorganized their relationship to pain in ways that produced behavior unlike anything that standard human pain response generated. The marked men were former soldiers, both NCR and Legion, who whose factional identities had been erased by the shared experience of the Divide's destruction, with the same comprehensiveness that the blast had erased their skin. The ideological commitments that had defined who they were in relation to each other before the Divide's nuclear detonations had not survived the encounter with something that reduced all such distinctions to irrelevance, the categories of ally and enemy that military and factional identity depended upon, dissolving in the face of a shared experience so overwhelming that whatever had preceded it became inaccessible as a foundation for present identity. What remained was organized around the Divide itself, around the specific landscape that had produced their condition, and around the rage that the condition generated, directed without discrimination toward anything that entered the territory they had made their own, and that represented the world beyond the Divide that had either sent them there or had simply failed to be destroyed, along with everything else the Divide had consumed. The spore plants and their related botanical mutations represented the quietest and, in certain respects, the most ecologically pervasive of the wasteland's regional biological transformations, because plant life did not announce its transformation through the threat behaviors and territorial aggression that characterized the animal mutations, and could therefore be overlooked by travelers whose attention was organized around the rebus, more immediately and visibly dangerous biological hazards of the landscape. The spore plant's development of active defensive mechanisms, the ability to detect movement in its vicinity and respond to it through the projection of harmful biological material, represented a departure from the entirely passive relationship to threat that the pre-war plant kingdom had maintained across its entire evolutionary history. Plants did not, in the pre-war world, detect and respond to animal movement. They endured it, suffered it, recovered from it through growth, or were consumed by it and ceased to function as individual organisms. The development in some wasteland plant lineages of the capability to actively participate in their own defense against animal predation through mechanisms that the pre-war plant kingdom had not possessed represented one of the more quietly significant evolutionary developments of the post-war period, a blurring of the boundary between plant and animal ecological roles that had been, before the bombs, one of the most fundamental organizing distinctions in the biological world. Section 10. The Forgotten Experiments, Centaurs, Floaters, Harold, and FEV's Strangest Results. The forced evolutionary virus did not always produce results that its operators had specified, or that its biological logic, such as it could be understood from the outside, would have predicted. The standard outcomes, the comprehensive physical transformation of the supermutant, the partial and idiosyncratic transformation of the ghoul, the specific modifications that the virus produced in the non-human organisms it was applied to represented the central tendency of a biological process operating within the parameters of its design. But the Mariposa vats, which ran without supervision for 2 centuries in a landscape saturated with the radiation that had already modified the virus from its original form, did not consistently produce outcomes that fell within any standard distribution. They produced, in addition to the armies of supermutants that the Master organized and deployed, a range of biological results that the Master's program made use of where use could be found, and that existed at the margins of his operations in forms that resisted any straightforward classification within the taxonomies that the Wastelands biology had developed for organizing its understanding of what the post-war world had created. These results were not failures in the sense of outcomes that fell short of the intended standard. They were expressions of a biological process operating at the extreme edges of its capability, in conditions that exceeded anything its designers had anticipated, producing organisms whose existence demonstrated that the range of what the forced evolutionary virus could do was broader than any pre-war assessment of its potential had suggested. The Centaur is perhaps the most biologically improbable organism that the post-war world contains, and the reason for its improbability is not difficult to articulate once the organism's actual nature is understood. A centaur is not a transformed human being, or a transformed dog, or any other transformed single organism. It is the product of a process in which the Mariposa vats, operating on multiple organisms simultaneously, produced not individual transformations, but fusion events, encounters between the genetic material of multiple distinct species within the viral environment of the vat that resulted not in the death or the rejection of incompatible biological material, but in a synthesis, partial and disorganized, but functional in the minimal sense of producing an organism that continued to exist and to move and to interact with the world around it. The human components that centaurs typically display, the faces, the limbs, the fragments of recognizable human anatomy visible within bodies that combine them with canine and other mammalian elements in configurations that no developmental biology could have produced through normal organismal development, are not metaphorical or superficial. They are the literal biological remnants of the humans who entered those vats, preserved within the synthesized organism in whatever form the fusion event's chemistry permitted, rather than transformed into the standard supermutant configuration that individual exposure produced. The behavior of centaurs is organized around neither the tactical aggression of the supermutant nor the predatory intelligence of the Deathclaw, but something more disoriented and more reactive: the territorial hostility of an AS organism whose multiple biological systems cannot fully coordinate their responses to the stimuli they collectively receive, producing defensive and offensive behavior that is vigorous but erratic in ways that reflect the fundamental incoherence of the biological architecture it emerges from. A centaur is dangerous, not because it is effective, but because it is present and motivated and possessed of physical capabilities whose specific character is difficult to predict, precisely because the organism's biology does not organize those capabilities toward any coherent end. The East Coast centaurs, associated with the supermutant populations of the capital wasteland, represented a somewhat different variant from those encountered in California. The specific characteristics of the Vault 87 strain and the different population of organisms present in the Mariposa environment, producing results whose divergence from the California baseline reflected the same variability that every other application of FEV in different conditions had demonstrated. The floater, which inhabited the margins of the master's operations in California and was encountered in the regions where his army had been active, presented a different category of biological mystery from the centaur, because it did not carry within its body the visible evidence of the organisms it had derived from, in the way that the centaur's fragmentary human anatomy provided a clear indication of its origins. The floater appeared to derive from a mollusk or related soft-bodied marine invertebrate lineage, an origin hypothesis that raised immediate questions about how an aquatic organism of that lineage had come to be present in the lineage in from Mariposa vats in the first place, questions that the available records of the facility's operations did not clearly answer. The FEV transformation that the floater had undergone produced an organism that retained enough of the mollusk's body organization to suggest the lineage, while modifying it so comprehensively that the specific ancestral species was not identifiable with certainty from the result alone. Most significantly, it produced an organism capable of sustained aerial locomotion through a biological inflation mechanism, the generation and management of gases within a body structure modified to function as a lifting surface that had no clear analogue in either the mollusk lineage the floater had descended from, or in any other biological system that the pre-war world's natural history contained. The floater's attack mechanism involved the projection of biological material at targets, a convergence with the bloatfly's approach that reflected, perhaps, the particular evolutionary logic of organisms that had developed ranged attack capability. without the limb-based physical contact mechanisms that most predatory organisms relied upon, finding in projection a functional substitute for the grasping and striking that their body plans did not support. Whether the floater's creation served any purpose within the master's operational framework, beyond the incidental utility of an organism that would engage his enemies on his behalf, was not clear from any documented source. The research logic that had produced it, if any such logic had governed its creation rather than the simple variability of vats operating beyond their designed parameters, was not preserved in any record that subsequent investigation had located. It existed. It persisted in the regions where the master's operations had been concentrated long after those operations ceased. It represented a direction in biological creativity that the post-war world had produced once, and that the subsequent history of FEV application in other regions had not reproduced, suggesting that its creation had been specific to the conditions of the Mariposa vats in ways that those conditions alone had made possible. Harold does not belong to any of the categories that the wastelands taxonomy of transformed beings has developed, and the inadequacy of every available category for his case is itself informative about the range of what FEV was capable of producing when it acted on a specific individual at a specific moment under specific conditions that had not been repeated in any documented subsequent instance. He was a businessman in the pre-war world, a man of ordinary ambition and ordinary complexity who found himself, in the chaos of the early post-war period, drawn into the conflict surrounding the Mariposa military base and exposed to the forced evolutionary virus in a context and through a mechanism that his own accounts of the event did not consistently agree upon the specific details of what had happened to him, varying across the many retellings that a life of Harold's extraordinary length inevitably generated. His memory of the event colored by the subsequent decades of living with its consequences in ways that made any single version of the story less reliable than the accumulated evidence of what it had produced. What the virus did to Harold was partial and idiosyncratic in ways that distinguished it absolutely from every other documented FEV outcome. His cognitive function was entirely preserved, not reduced, as in the super mutant, or altered without fundamental disruption, as in some ghoul variants, but simply preserved, intact and continuous, from the pre-exposure Harold through every subsequent version of himself, across the decades and then the centuries that followed. His body was modified in ways that reflected FEV's influence without following any of the standard pathways that influence normally expressed itself through changes to his physical appearance that were real and progressive, but that produced not the super mutant's dramatic restructuring or the ghoul's specific desiccation and luminescence, but something unique, something that had no name because nothing else had produced it, and no name had therefore been required. And from his skull grew a thing that began small enough that it might have been dismissed as an unusual growth, and that became, across the decades of Harold's wandering life, a tree, a living, developing, eventually self-directing organism rooted in Harold's skull that he named and addressed and maintained a relationship with across a century of shared existence. Harold named his tree Herbert, then Bob, then returned to Herbert in a renegotiation of the relationship that the tree's own apparent development of preferences and responses had precipitated. Whether Herbert was sentient in any meaningful sense, whether there was something it was like to be the tree growing from Harold's skull, whether the growth's apparent responsiveness to Harold's emotional states and external conditions reflected a form of experience rather than simple biological reactivity, was a question that Harold returned to repeatedly. Across the many conversations he had with the many people he encountered in his wandering, and that he never resolved to his own complete satisfaction, the uncertainty did not prevent him from maintaining the relationship. He talked to Herbert. He consulted Herbert, in the loose and provisional sense that consulting an entity whose communication was indirect and easily interpretable in multiple ways permitted consultation. He worried about Herbert's welfare in the specific way that a person worries about the welfare of something they are responsible for and cannot fully understand, which was, Harold sometimes observed, not so different from the way that people worried about most of the things they were responsible for. Harold wandered the wasteland for more than a century, his physical transformation continuing slowly rather than completing itself in the abrupt way that super mutant transformation completed itself. The FEV in his system doing its work across decades rather than hours, producing progressive changes in his body that he observed with the particular combination of scientific curiosity and personal resignation that a very long life in unusual circumstances cultivates in those constitutionally disposed toward equanimity. He accumulated experiences and relationships and losses with the slow comprehensiveness of someone who had simply been present in the post-war world for longer than almost anyone else who could report on that presence. And he developed from this accumulation a perspective on the wasteland's history and its inhabitants that was unlike any other perspective available, because no other perspective had been maintained across the same span of time in the same state of continuous, engaged, reflective consciousness. The oasis that grew up around Harold in the capital wasteland in the decades before the lone wanderer encountered, it was the physical expression of what Herbert had become when the tree's growth had extended far enough and deep enough, and comprehensively enough that it had ceased to be a feature of Harold's body and had become a landscape feature in its own right, roots extending through the soil in every direction from Harold's fixed position, leaves and branches, and the specific microclimate that a living tree produces, spreading across an area that the capital wasteland's otherwise devastated vegetation could not have produced. The community that organized itself around this landscape had found in Harold's existence a foundation for religious meaning that Harold himself regarded with the complicated feelings of a person who has been assigned a spiritual significance they did not request and cannot entirely escape. They venerated him. He had opinions about this. His opinions were not simple, and they were not consistent across the many years of his stationary life at the center of the oasis. Because the question of what to do with the meaning that other people found in your existence was not a question that anyone had developed adequate tools for answering, and Harold had more experience with the question than anyone else in the wasteland, without having arrived at more certainty about the answer. The lobotomites of Old World blues occupied a different kind of extreme from Harold's singular case, not the partial transformation that had preserved his personhood while modifying his biology, but the comprehensive neurological modification that had eliminated the higher functions of human consciousness, while leaving the body that housed those functions operational in the reduced form that the removal required. The researchers of Big Mountain had developed, as part of their broader program of human biological and neurological modification, the capability and the willingness to remove significant portions of a person's brain function and replace the absent capacity with mechanical components that maintained basic motor and navigational function without the cognitive complexity that the biological tissue being replaced had supported. The lobotomites that populated the Big Mountain facility were the result of this capability applied to the human beings who had entered the facility and who had not left it in any form that retained the personhood they had carried in. They moved through the facility's environments with the purposeful directionless of organisms that have enough neural function to generate movement and enough residual behavioral patterning to generate aggression, but that cannot organize either into the goal-directed activity that intact human cognition produces. The spore carriers represented the research direction of Big Mountain, extended into territory whose implications were more immediately biological, but whose moral character was continuous with the lobotomite program's fundamental orientation toward the human beings it had used as its material. Organisms produced by the facility's research into biological vectors. Humans transformed through the application of specific biological and chemical agents into mobile delivery mechanisms for spore material. Their bodies restructured to produce and distribute the biological compounds that the research program had designed them to carry. The spore carriers moved through the environments they inhabited as the biological equipment they had been made into, the persons they had been before the transformation, as absent from their functioning as the lobotomites' higher cognition was absent from theirs. The transformation in their case, biological rather than mechanical, but no less comprehensive in its elimination of what had preceded it, what they carried and distributed, and what the long-term ecological consequences of their distribution activity were for the environments they moved through, was a question that the wasteland's surviving scientific capacity had not fully answered, partly because the environments they primarily inhabited were ones that the limitations of available equipment and the threats of Big Mountain's other inhabitants made systematic investigation practically difficult. Together, these organisms, at the outer edges of what FEV and pre-war human science produced when operating without constraint or direction, represented something that the wasteland's standard frameworks for understanding its biology struggled to fully accommodate a category of existence that was neither the natural mutation that radiation produced, nor the deliberate engineering of specific capabilities, but the consequence of processes that had exceeded their intended parameters in directions that no one had specified, and that the organisms resulting from those processes had to inhabit without any of the evolutionary preparation that would normally accompany the existence of a genuinely novel form of life. They existed in a world that had not made room for what they were, because the world could not have anticipated what they would be, and they persisted in that world with the same fundamental biological insistence on continuation that every organism the wasteland contained had demonstrated across 2 centuries of conditions that had provided more reasons to stop than to continue. Section 11. The question of personhood, synths, intelligent mutants, and what the wasteland made. There is a question that the wasteland forces upon everyone who moves through it long enough and attentively enough to encounter the full range of what it contains. And the question cannot be avoided by limiting one's attention to the physical landscape or to the immediate tactical demands of survival, because the question is embedded in the landscape itself, in every feral ghoul moving through the ruins of a city it once lived in every super mutant who speaks with a patience and a precision that the standard assessment of its kind did not predict, in every synthetic human walking through the Commonwealth with the full weight of a life's worth of memories that were given to it rather than accumulated, and in every being that occupies the difficult middle ground between the categories that the wasteland's inhabitants have developed for organizing their understanding of what the world around them contains. The question is not new. It is among the oldest questions that human philosophical inquiry has attempted to address, traced across every tradition of thought that the pre-war world produced in the centuries before the bombs rendered most of those traditions inaccessible to the people who might have found them useful. What makes a being a person? What is it that generates the moral consideration that the concept of personhood is designed to protect? And does that thing reside in the physical form that a being inhabits? Or in the kind of mind that the being possesses? Or in some relationship between the two that neither alone is sufficient to define? The pre-war world had the luxury of treating this as a theoretical problem. The wasteland does not have that luxury. In the wasteland, the question is practical and immediate, and loaded with the specific weight of decisions that cannot be deferred until the philosophical literature has reached adequate consensus, because the beings whose status the question bears upon are present in the landscape right now, and the decisions being made about them right now have consequences that are as real and as irreversible as any other consequence the wasteland produces. The Institute's synthetic humans, the Generation 3 synths, whose biology was grown rather than built, whose organic tissue was indistinguishable from natural human tissue by any examination available to the Commonwealth's medical and scientific resources outside the Institute itself, represent the form of this question that the Commonwealth is. Wasteland's most technologically sophisticated institution produced, and the form that most clearly demonstrates the gap between what a question requires and what the institutions confronting it are willing to provide. The Institute arrived at the capability for creating fully biological synthetic humans through decades of research in the deepest secrecy, building on the mechanical and computational foundations of their earlier Generation 1 and Generation 2 synths in a direction that the earlier generation's limitations had pointed toward, but that required a qualitative leap in biological engineering capability to achieve. The Generation 1 synths were robots in the most straightforward sense of the term, humanoid in their physical design, functional in their assigned tasks, possessed of artificial intelligence, sophisticated enough to carry out complex instructions and to navigate variable environments, but not possessed of anything that the concept of personhood was designed to protect, and not claiming anything that the concept might have been extended to cover. The Generation 2 synths represented an improvement in both mechanical sophistication and behavioral flexibility, capable enough and autonomous enough in their operation that the distinction between them and something that deserved moral consideration was less immediately obvious than it had been with the Generation 1s, but still resolvable on examination in the direction of tool rather than person. The Generation 3 synth was not resolvable in that direction. It was not resolvable in any direction that the Institute's institutional framework had developed adequate tools for approaching honestly, which was precisely why the Institute had not developed those tools, because the conclusions that honest engagement with the question would have required would have been institutionally catastrophic, would have undermined the foundational justifications for the research program, and the operational practices that the program supported, would have forced a reckoning with what the Institute had been doing to the beings it created, that the Institute's culture was not prepared to sustain. A Generation 3 synth possessed organic tissue that was functionally identical to natural human tissue. It possessed an artificial intelligence whose depth and complexity produced not simulated, not approximated, but produced the full range of cognitive and emotional responses that characterized human consciousness at its most complete. It could form genuine relationships, experience genuine distress, develop genuine preferences and genuine attachments and genuine fears about the things it had reason to fear. It could dream in the neurological sense of that word, and the content of its dreams was not random data processing, but the organized expression of the experiences and concerns and unresolved material that its waking life had accumulated, in the way that any mind with sufficient complexity and sufficient experience generates when its processing is freed from the immediate demands of the waking environment. The Institute knew all of this, because the Institute had built it, and the Institute had built it deliberately. The cognitive and emotional depth of the Generation 3 synth was not an accidental byproduct of the research program, but one of its explicit goals, because a synthetic human that could pass undetected among natural humans required the full range of human responses, rather than an approximation sufficient only for casual observation. The railroad operated from the position that what the Institute had built was persons, and that the conditions under which those persons existed within the Institute and were deployed from it constituted a moral violation of the same fundamental category as the slavery that the pre-war world had practiced, and that the pre-war world investors, New California Republic's founding documents, had formally rejected. The railroad's understanding of this position was not naively simple. Its members had engaged with the question of synth personhood with enough seriousness to develop a sophisticated account of why the cognitive and emotional characteristics of Generation 3 synths generated the protections that personhood generated, and why the fact of their artificial origin did not alter this conclusion in any way that a morally coherent framework could sustain. The origin of a mind was not, in the railroad's position, relevant to the consideration that mind deserved. What was relevant was what the mind was, what it could experience, what it could lose, what it felt when it was treated as property, rather than as a being whose existence had its own inherent value that the purposes of others could not simply override. The railroad acted on this position at significant personal risk, and with the awareness that the institutional power arrayed against it was essentially without limit in the region it operated within. It acted anyway because the alternative was complicity, and complicity was a choice that the railroad's members had individually and collectively decided was not available to them. The synths who escaped the Institute and reached the railroad, who accepted the new memories and new identities that the railroad's operatives provided as the mechanism for their integration into surface life. These beings carried with them the philosophical question their existence raised, not as an abstraction, but as the organizing fact of every aspect of their experience. They did not know, in most cases, whether the memories that felt most fundamental to their identity had been their own or had been installed. They did not know whether the relationships that felt most genuine were relationships they had formed or relationships that had been designed into their biographical implants. They knew only what they felt, which was everything that any person felt, and that they were here, and that they were not going back, and that the life they were building on the surface was the only life they had access to and was worth the effort of building, regardless of the metaphysical uncertainties that attended it. The synth, who had lived in a Commonwealth settlement for years, who had formed friendships and contributed to a community and developed the local knowledge and the specific attachments that constituted membership in a place, and who then discovered or was told what they were. This person's response to that discovery was not a computational output, it was a human response. With all the complexity and the grief and the disorientation and the eventual negotiation with a new self-understanding that any person's encounter with a fundamental revision of what they knew about themselves produced. The Institute had made them capable of that response. The response was real. These facts were not intention, they were the same fact, approached from two directions. The intelligent ghouls who had survived the Great War and lived through the 2 centuries that followed it carried their personhood through a transformation that the wasteland's social frameworks had not. In most regions and in most communities, developed adequate mechanisms for receiving and honoring. They were persons before the transformation. This was not contested, not even by the communities that subsequently treated them as threats rather than as people. They were persons after the transformation. This was the claim that those same communities found practically difficult to sustain, not because the argument for it was weak, but because the visceral response to the transformed body was stronger in most people and most circumstances than the philosophical argument could override in real time. The gap between what the intelligent ghoul was and how the wasteland's human communities responded to what the intelligent ghoul looked like was not a gap that better arguments reliably closed. It was a gap that required something slower and more effortful than argument of the accumulated experience of specific relationships with specific ghouls over sufficient time that the visceral response was gradually overwritten by the evidence of the actual person rather than the anticipated threat. This process worked in the places where it was permitted to work. It was simply not permitted to work everywhere, or even in most places. And the intelligent ghouls, who needed it to work in order to find shelter and community and the basic human recognition of their existence as something that mattered, were not always in places where the conditions for the process existed. The super mutants, whose cognitive function, FEV, had not fully eliminated, existed in a social position that was in certain respects more difficult than the intelligent ghouls. Because the intelligent ghouls' claim to personhood rested on an obvious continuity. The person who had been there before the transformation was still there, recognizably, in the patterns of speech and memory and emotional response that the ghouls' behavior expressed. The super mutants' claim rested on something less immediately obvious, because the transformation was more comprehensive and its relationship to the person who had preceded it was less clearly continuous. Marcus remembered who he had been before the transformation, but the person he remembered was not the person he was. The cognitive architecture that FEV had rebuilt was genuinely different from the one it had replaced, and the memories of the earlier self were preserved in a mind that processed them differently from the mind that had originally formed them, producing a form of self-knowledge that was accurate in content and discontinuous in character. He was the person who had had those experiences. He was also not quite that person, and the distance between those two truths was one that he had learned to inhabit without resolving, because resolution was not available and inhabitation was. What every intelligent being in the wasteland, whose physical form did not match the standard human template shared, was the experience of having their personhood treated as a hypothesis, requiring confirmation rather than a fact requiring only acknowledgement. The standard human traveler who encountered an unfamiliar human being in the wasteland extended to that person the provisional recognition that personhood generates not unconditional trust, not the absence of threat assessment, but the baseline assumption that the being in front of them was a person rather than a thing, and that this assumption would govern the initial terms of the encounter unless specific evidence overrode it. The same traveler who encountered an unfamiliar ghoul or an unfamiliar super mutant did not, in most cases, extend this provisional recognition. They extended instead the provisional threat assessment that the wasteland's ecology had trained them to apply to unfamiliar biological entities, and the burden of overcoming that assessment fell entirely on the ghoul or the super mutant, who was required to demonstrate their personhood through behavior in a context where the window for that demonstration was extremely narrow, and the consequences of its failure were final. This asymmetry was not simply an intellectual error correctable by better information. It was the expression of survival instincts shaped by 2 centuries of an environment in which the correct response to most unfamiliar biological entities was immediate defensive action, and the cost of applying that response incorrectly to a person was vastly lower than the cost of failing to apply it to a genuine threat. The logic was not irrational. The logic was simply cruel in its application to the beings who were its victims, and the cruelty did not become less real because the logic that produced it was understandable. The question that all of these beings collectively posed the ghoul walking through the ruins of a world they remembered alive, the super mutant who carried their grandchildren's voices across 2 centuries of transformation, the synthetic human living in a settlement that did not know what they were, the intelligent Deathclaws who had asked the New California Republic for the recognition that their intelligence generated and had been eliminated before the answer arrived, was not a question about categories. It was a question about attention. It was asking whether the beings who moved through the wasteland with the outward form of persons would receive the attention that persons deserved, the specific, patient, individual attention that sees what is actually present, rather than what the category implies ought to be present, that recognizes the grief in the ghoul's eyes as grief, and the love in the super mutant's voice as love, and the fear in the synth's posture as fear, not because these expressions match the template of human expression precisely, but because they are close enough to it that the only reason not to receive them as what they are is the decision not to look closely enough to see them. The wasteland had produced, through the mechanism of catastrophe and the century upon century of transformation that catastrophe had set in motion, a world in which the question of personhood could not be answered by looking at a face, or reading a form, or applying a category. It could only be approached through the willingness to encounter what was actually there, to stand in the presence of a being whose history was written in a body that the bombs and the virus and the centuries had made strange, and to ask not what the body implied about the being inside it, but what the being itself, given the opportunity to be present on its own terms, actually was. The wasteland asked this of everyone who moved through it, with enough attention to notice what it contained. It did not promise that the answer would be comfortable, or that the commitment required to act on it would be costless, or that the communities capable of extending genuine recognition to the full range of beings the wasteland had produced would find that extension easy to sustain against the pressures that made the simpler and crueler response so much more available. It simply made the question unavoidable and left the answering to the people and the beings who inhabited it every day, without the luxury of deferring to a framework that had already resolved it satisfactorily, and without the option of pretending that the question had not been asked. Section 12. Outro. The wasteland, at night, is quieter than the day permits it to be. The Deathclaw has returned to the territory it will defend again tomorrow, with the same absolute commitment it brought to defending it today. The Radroach has retreated to the darkness beneath the collapsed floor, where the warmth of the day's accumulated heat in the broken masonry will sustain it through the hours of cold. The Mirelurk has settled back into the contaminated water from which it emerged at dusk, its carapace submerged, its biology processing the radioactive chemistry of the water around it in the slow, continuous, uninterrupted way that its transformed physiology was built to process it. The Yaoguai has found the sheltered place in the rocks, where it rests between one day's territorial patrol and the next. The ghoul, who remembers the world before all of this, who carries in their memory the specific sound and specific light of a morning 2 centuries ago, when everything was still ordinary and still intact and still organized around the far assumption that tomorrow would resemble today, has found whatever shelter this particular night offers and has closed their eyes on a landscape that their memory can still compare to what it used to be. And the comparison is still painful, and they make it anyway, because the memory is theirs and the pain is theirs, and the continued existence of both is itself a form of testimony that the world, whatever it has become, has not yet taken from them. The creatures we have moved through tonight, from the smallest and the most ancient to the largest and the most recently made, from the radroach in the basement to the fog crawler in the grey coastal murk of the island's shores, are not simply the hazards of a dangerous landscape. They are the landscape's autobiography. They are the record, written in living tissue and in the behavioral languages of organisms shaped by conditions that the pre-war world set in motion without understanding what it was setting in motion, of everything that the Great War produced when it released the forces that had been building in the pre-war world for long enough that their release was, in hindsight, inevitable. The Deathclaw that no one can any longer call a weapon, the Night Stalker that no one can any longer call an experiment, the Brahmin whose transformed biology makes possible the trade networks that connect the human communities of a world that would otherwise be collections of isolated and mutually ignorant settlements, slowly dying in the self-containment that the absence of connection produces. The ghoul, who is a person and who has always been a person and who will remain a person, regardless of whether the community they are approaching tonight chooses to recognize that fact or acts on the simpler and crueler alternative. What all of them share across the vast range of what they are and what they were, and what the distance between those two things cost, is the quality that the wasteland most relentlessly selects for, and that its history most honestly documents. They persisted, not all of them, and not without cost, and not in forms that the organisms they began as would have recognized or chosen. But the biological insistence on continuation, the deep, precognitive, cellular commitment to remaining that is not courage and is not wisdom and does not require either, that is simply the most fundamental property that living systems possess, carried them through conditions that the world that produced them had not designed them to survive. And what emerged on the other side of those conditions was not what had entered them, and was real, and was here, and continued to be here, in the darkness of the wasteland's night, in the spaces between the ruins and the dust, and the slow half-life decay of the material that the bombs had poisoned, and that time was, with a patience that operated on timescales beyond the human, gradually rendering less poisonous. The human beings who move through this world, who navigate its contaminated terrain and manage its extraordinary biological hazards, and build within it the fragile and imperfect and genuinely remarkable communities that 2 centuries of effort have produced share this quality with every creature the world has made around them. They too persisted. They too emerged from conditions that should have been terminal in forms that the world they came from would not have predicted, shaped by pressures that the pre-war civilization had not prepared them for, and that they had to meet with the resources the wasteland made available, rather than the resources they would have chosen. The settler in Megaton building a wall from the corrugated metal of a collapsed pre-war factory is doing what the Mirelurk does when it grows a carapace from the chemistry of the contaminated bay, finding within the specific conditions of the world as it is the material for a response adequate to what those conditions demand. The caravan guard, walking the route between settlements, with the awareness of every sightline and every sound and every silence that might mean a Deathclaw, has noticed them before they noticed it, is doing what the Night Stalker does when it hunts, applying the capabilities that their formation in this world produced to the specific problems that this world presents. The ghoul who walks toward an unfamiliar settlement knowing that the response to their approach is genuinely uncertain and who walks toward it anyway, because shelter and community and the basic human recognition of their existence as something that matters is worth the risk of not receiving it, is doing what the most fundamental biological and psychological drives that the human organism possesses have always directed it to do. In conditions of uncertainty and need, they are trying. The wasteland has never made trying easy, and it has never guaranteed that trying will succeed, and the trying continues regardless. The creatures of the wasteland are not, in the final accounting that a night spent in their company makes possible, separate from the human story of the post-war world. They are part of it, entangled with it in ways that the 2 centuries of coexistence have made so thoroughly mutual that the separation is no longer possible, even in imagination. The Brahmin that carries the caravan's goods between the hub and shady sands is as much a part of the new California Republic's history as any general or senator. The Deathclaw, whose territorial range makes a specific mountain pass impassable, has shaped the political geography of the settlements on either side of that range as surely as any wall or treaty. The radroach in the basement of every vault that opened its doors is the first creature that every vault dweller learned to be afraid of, and the first creature they learned to kill. And that learning is part of every vault dweller's entry into the surface world, part of the formation that produced the specific people who built the specific communities that the wasteland's human history records. The wasteland's creatures did not merely inhabit the world that human survivors were trying to rebuild. They were constitutive of it, woven into its ecology and its economy and its psychology and its geography in ways that the world could not be understood without them. This understanding does not require that the Deathclaw be appreciated as anything other than the apex predator it is. It does not require that the fire ant colony be visited with anything other than the thorough, practical response that its proximity to a settlement demands. The ecological significance of a creature and the immediate threat it represents are not mutually exclusive assessments, and the wasteland's inhabitants have never had the luxury of treating them as if they were. The recognition that the rad scorpion occupies a genuine ecological role in the wasteland's food web, and that the rad scorpion will kill you if you approach it without adequate preparation, are both true simultaneously. And the person who survives in the wasteland is the person who holds both truths at once, rather than the one who allows either to crowd out the other. But the ecological significance, the biological history, the place of each creature in the long and complicated story of what the post-war world made from the materials the Great War left behind, these things are real, and they deserve the attention that reality deserves. And the night is long enough to give them that attention before the morning requires the simpler and more immediate assessments that survival makes non-negotiable. The beings whose personhood the wasteland's social frameworks struggled to accommodate, the ghouls and the super mutants and the synthetic humans and the intelligent Deathclaws, who asked only to be seen as what they were and who were, in most cases, seen as something else, instead did not disappear from the wasteland because that accommodation was difficult. They remained in it, living their lives in the specific forms those lives had been given to them, carrying their grief and their memory and their hope and their stubborn insistence on being present in a world that had not always made room for them. They remain in it now, in the darkness of this particular night, in the ruins and the surviving settlements and the open roads between them, and the fact of their remaining is not nothing. It is, by the measure of what the wasteland asks of everything that inhabits it. Among the more remarkable things, the post-war world contains the persistence of beings for whom persistence was always more costly than it was for the organisms whose forms the world expected and whose presence it accommodated. As a matter of routine, let all of that settle now, gently, into the quiet that the night permits. The Geiger counter is silent, the road is still, the creatures of the wasteland have found their rest, each in the form and the place that 2 centuries of transformation has fitted them for. And the ruins that once were cities are quiet in the particular way that places are quiet when the living things within them are at rest rather than at the work of surviving. The Brahmin lows softly somewhere in the dark beyond the settlement's wall. The Yao Guai breathes slowly in the shelter of its rocky outcropping. The ghoul, with 2 centuries of memory behind their closed eyes, is, for this hour, simply sleeping, not surviving, not navigating, not managing the endless practical and social demands that their particular form of existence in this particular world generates, but resting, the way that every living thing with enough warmth and enough safety and enough quiet eventually rests, regardless of what it is or what the world has made it. You have walked through this world tonight with the patience and the attention it deserved. You have met its creatures in the fullness of what they are, rather than the reduction of what they threaten. And the knowledge you carry from this meeting, however much of it remains when the morning comes, and however much of it has dissolved into the deeper current of sleep that is already moving through you, is the knowledge of a far world that endured, and of the extraordinary, ordinary, costly, and continuing persistence of everything that endured within it. Rest now, wanderer. Let the dust settle on the broken roads, and the contaminated rivers find their slow way to the sea, and the long silence of the wasteland hold you as gently as anything in the wasteland can hold anything, which is gently enough. The watch is kept. The creatures of the world are what they are. The story continues, in every living thing that wakes tomorrow into whatever the wasteland's morning offers, and faces it as it has always been faced, with the only thing that the wasteland has ever finally required of anything it contains: the willingness to continue. F.